I've been living out here in the Appalachian Mountains for most of my life, and I always thought I knew what to expect once the sun went down. Coyotes yipping in the distance, maybe a black bear rustling around. Nothing much shakes me. But on this night, everything changed. Let me start by saying my evening had been uneventful, just chores and a quick dinner before midnight rolled around. Jax, my retriever, was curled up by the fireplace like he always is. He's the most relaxed dog on the planet, rarely even barks unless the mailman shows up. That's why I nearly dropped my coffee when I heard this growl coming from him, deep and raw, unlike anything I'd heard before. I glanced at him and saw he was standing rigid, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the window. I couldn't see anything but my own reflection in the glass, and I tried to shrug it off, mumbling something like, "Easy, buddy." But inside I was rattled. I've never seen Jax look that tense, tail stiff, nose practically glued to the window. It was enough to get my heart pounding. Soon, I realized I still had to lock up my workshop down the slope behind the house. Normally this isn't a big deal, just a quick trip in the dark with a flashlight, but the way Jax was acting, let's just say I was on edge. Still, I convinced myself it was no big deal. I grabbed my coat, clicked on the flashlight, and headed out. Jax insisted on coming, practically pressing against my leg with every step. Outside, the air felt strange. I couldn't place why. Maybe it was too still. No crickets, no wind through the branches, just a heavy quiet. Halfway to the workshop, Jax let out another warning growl that made my stomach tighten. Before I could turn on my heel, I noticed the workshop door was slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to keep going. I tugged the door shut and locked it, and that's when this insane commotion erupted in the woods behind me. I can't fully do the sound justice, but it was like a sudden surge of noise tearing through the undergrowth. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, almost like a crowd sprinting among the trees. I froze, and Jax just pressed against me, teeth bared. Whatever caused that ruckus had to be larger than a raccoon or fox. It sounded massive. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the flashlight, nearly dropping it. I backed up toward the house, trying not to break into a sprint, though my legs were begging me to run. The closer we got to the porch, the more frantic everything felt. I got inside, practically shoved the door shut, and slid the deadbolt into place. My brain was racing, trying to explain what I'd just heard. A bunch of deer. A bear with cubs. But it was so loud, so widespread, like multiple creatures. I stood in the hallway, breath hitching, Jax at my feet, staring at the door. I realized I'd left my pistol upstairs. Adrenaline was making my hands tremble. My pulse hammered as I rushed to my bedroom, grabbed the gun, and made sure it was loaded. I've never felt so desperate to be armed in my own home. Just as I debated whether to investigate or hide, Jax let out a bark. That bark. He only does that when something's seriously wrong. So, against every instinct, I headed back out onto the porch with my flashlight and pistol. My chest was tight, my breathing uneven, but I needed to know if there was an intruder or some animal messing around. I scanned the tree line with the beam. Nothing moved. Silence reigned, almost unnaturally, as though nature itself took a step back, waiting to see what I'd do next. Then, just as I was about to turn and go inside, I heard this low murmur, more like a swarm of hushed voices than a single sound. It came from the very edge of my property, out near where the trees thickened. My stomach dropped. It didn't sound like English, but it was disturbingly close to speech. Jax whimpered, tail tucked, as if he wanted to drag me inside. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like eyes were on me, a presence both everywhere and nowhere. The murmurs seemed to shift direction, echoing out from multiple spots at once. My light swept across the yard, revealing not one silhouette, not one flicker of movement. Yet the voices, if that's what they were, didn't stop. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I thought I might collapse right there on the porch. I forced myself to breathe through it, whispering Jax's name for a shred of comfort. After what felt like ages, I managed to pull myself back inside. That door had never felt so flimsy. I latched it and checked the windows, too spooked to turn on any indoor lights, hoping that darkness would hide me. The night wasn't over, though. I had a terrible feeling this was only the beginning. Like whatever was out there wasn't done with me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with some random animal. This felt orchestrated, purposeful, and it was tightening around me, step by step. I didn't have a clue what was causing it, but I knew one thing for sure. My home, my safe space, was no longer secure. Jax's instincts had been right from the start, and I dreaded what might be next. I had barely closed my eyes for a second, couldn't rest even if I tried, with every nerve in my body on high alert. Jax was tense, pacing the living room and refusing to leave the front door. I kept the lights off, thinking somehow it would make me less of a target. My phone sat on the table, but out here in the middle of nowhere, good luck trying to call for help. Even if I did get a signal, what could I possibly say to emergency services? Hello, yes, there are voices surrounding my house, and I don't see anyone but my dog is freaking out. That weird muttering from outside seemed to vibrate through the walls, like a low chorus of whispers just behind the wooden panels. It was maddening because I couldn't single out a phrase or identify if it was even human speech. It rose and fell in waves, and every so often it almost sounded like chanting, I guess. I was too rattled to be sure. All I knew was that my gut told me there were multiple presences out there. More than one set of footsteps had circled the house after I first came inside. After another minute of pacing, I finally thought, screw it, I need to see what's happening. I edged over to the window beside my front door, careful not to rustle the curtains. The instant I leaned forward, the noise outside cut off, like someone hit a switch. In its place was the deepest, most all-consuming silence. Not a single insect chirping, no rustle of leaves, just my own ragged breathing. I can't express how unsettling it is to realize that whatever's out there knows when you move. The second I froze, I heard a slight shuffle near the corner of the house. Then that quiet murmuring started back up again, more agitated than before. I grabbed my pistol from the coffee table and quietly approached another window that looked out toward the gravel driveway. Jax followed, ears down and tail stiff, as if he expected an attack. When I shifted the curtain a millimeter, the mumbles faded out again. Something was definitely keyed into every movement I made, and that realization caused my stomach to churn. Time dragged on. I checked my phone. 1:47 a.m. It had only been an hour since I'd first heard that thunderous crashing in the woods, but it felt like half the night had passed. I decided to kill the darkness with a chance at visibility, so I clicked on the porch light. Nothing in the yard, no bodies, no shapes, not even a stray raccoon. My flashlight remained on the table, but I felt no urge to go out there again. A part of me sensed if I opened that door, I'd be swallowed whole. Jax's eyes stayed locked on the windows. Now and then, a single footstep crunched the gravel outside, slow and deliberate. One step, pause. Another step, pause. It was unbearable not to open a window and yell, but I couldn't bring myself to be that reckless. My mind kept thinking back on old stories from my grandparents, about things in the hills that weren't exactly animal and not quite human either. Tales I'd once dismissed as pure folklore. But here I was, feeling cornered by something I couldn't see. To keep myself sane, I jotted notes on a pad. What times I heard the footsteps, what they sounded like, how the whispering seemed to move around the property in a clockwise pattern. Once or twice, I considered switching on music or the TV just to drown it out, but a voice in my head told me to stay alert, not to mask the sounds. After all, if something crashed through the door, I needed to know instantly. Hours crawled by this way. My nerves were shot, my hands clammy, and every muscle ached with tension. I found myself drifting off only to jolt awake seconds later whenever Jax twitched. It was like living on a fault line, expecting the earth to quake at any moment. Meanwhile, the murmurs persisted outside, underscored by that dead silent hush whenever I tried to move. It was a twisted game. They made sure I knew they were there, but not once did I see a face or a form. Sometime around 4:30, or maybe closer to 5 a.m., the tone of the murmuring changed. Hard to explain, but the pitch went lower, almost guttural. Then, slowly, the sound started drifting away, deeper into the woods. I caught faint rustling through the thick brush, then a final few snaps of branches. In their wake, frogs croaked and a couple of birds called. It was as if the natural world had been stifled all night and finally breathed again. Relief washed over me, but it wasn't that comforting. I still felt like I might vomit from the stress. I checked each window for any sign of movement. Nothing. The gravel driveway looked untouched, aside from my own footprints. Jax gradually relaxed, though he wouldn't lie down until the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon. Once I was fairly certain the immediate threat had disappeared, I stepped outside onto the porch for a breath of air, pistol clutched tight in my hand. The yard was a mess of broken branches, and the lingering smell of disturbed soil clung to the morning breeze. Yet, bizarrely, there were no footprints, no trace of a crowd or gang of animals. The only proof was in my shaking limbs and Jax's raw-edged stare. I spent sunrise going back and forth, mentally replaying each horrifying moment. My place still felt uneasy, like the echoes of those voices might start up again any second. I didn't dare pack up and leave. Part of me needed to know if this was a one-time nightmare or an ongoing threat. I downed 2 cups of coffee, watched the brightening sky, and told myself I'd figure out what to do next. For now, daylight was my only shield, and I was not about to let my guard down. Jax and I sat there in a haunted silence, expecting something to re-emerge, hoping that it wouldn't. Sunrise brought the faintest sense of relief, yet my nerves still buzzed with every stray sound. I locked the doors, sealed every window, and tried to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing about it fit neatly into the realm of normal. Part of me wanted to believe that it was some freak incident, maybe a collective hallucination brought on by stress. Still, the unease in my chest whispered that whatever took up residence in the darkness that night is out there, lurking beyond the edges of reason, waiting for another moment to slip back into my world. For now, I've recounted every detail here, hoping to warn others. Sometimes, the eerie stories we dismiss might be truer than we're willing to admit. I've been drawn to the Appalachian region for as long as I can remember. Something about those towering slopes and shadowy hollows always felt like a gateway into a different world. Beautiful, yet laced with an unsettling aura that's tough to articulate. A few friends and I decided to head out to Holly River State Park in West Virginia, lured by rumors of an old family cemetery hidden up on a ridge. We had only a vague idea of where it might be. All we knew was that we needed to follow a winding trail that cut through dense undergrowth before climbing up toward this rumored graveyard. So the 3 of us piled into my car early that morning, excited by the prospect of a day hike. The drive itself was so quiet that we began making offhand jokes, like something was waiting out there, just beyond view. Maybe it was nerves talking, or maybe I'd had too much coffee. Either way, my stomach churned in that weird way it does when you're both excited and half spooked. When we arrived, the parking lot near the main trailhead had a few vehicles, but we didn't cross paths with any actual people. The entire place seemed deserted. We shrugged, figuring everyone must have already started their morning treks. After all, Holly River is a decently sized park. Folks could be scattered across countless trails. I tried to keep my mind on the gorgeous landscape, moss-covered stones, towering hardwoods, and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Yet there was this hush underneath it all, like nature had dialed itself down a notch. We kicked off our hike around midday. The sky was overcast, so the light filtering through the branches came in muted silvery patches. The trail was pretty well worn at first, so we made quick progress. The chatter between us died off once we noticed how oddly calm the forest felt. Everything about the place demanded our attention, from the tangled roots underfoot to the looming canopy overhead. Occasionally we'd catch snatches of movement in our peripheral vision, maybe squirrels, but the scuttling always stopped the moment we tried to look closer. My friend commented that it seemed like the place was sizing us up, and nobody argued. We pressed on, climbing steadily. Eventually, we left the official trail in search of that old graveyard. The path we followed was more of a half-remembered rumor than a marked route. A fallen tree forced us to detour through thick brush, and my arms got scratched up enough that I started wishing we'd picked an easier day hike. Still, I couldn't help feeling compelled to keep going. There was a raw, ancient feel to the land that I couldn't let go of. A couple hours in, the terrain turned steep. Loose stones threatened to send us sliding if we weren't careful, and we had to cling to exposed roots for stability. We nearly missed the cemetery altogether, spotting it only because of a warped iron gate that caught the corner of my friend's eye. A row of leaning tombstones stood beyond, the lettering on them faded and chipped. If I didn't know any better, I'd say they'd been here for centuries. Up close, the graveyard gave off an atmosphere that bordered on oppressive. The headstones bore names we could barely read, and the ground was covered in tangled weeds. The three of us wandered, taking pictures and gingerly brushing aside overgrown vines. Every so often, a subtle breeze would move past us, bringing with it a musty odor that reminded me of damp soil and decaying leaves. My pulse was hammering in my ears for reasons I couldn't explain, but I tried to play it cool. We stayed longer than we intended, mostly because we were fascinated, and maybe a little horrified, by the idea that entire families could be buried out here, forgotten by time. Each time the wind picked up, we paused, half expecting something or someone to step out from behind those looming trees. It was all in my head, I told myself, probably just a side effect of being in a graveyard at sunset. By the time we left, the sun had started sliding down the sky, painting the ridge in murky oranges and purples. We hadn't planned on night hiking, but it was creeping up on us fast. The idea of navigating a dark forest trail made our nerves spike, so we decided the park's main road would be safer, even if it was a bit out of the way. We figured it couldn't be more than a few miles to loop around and reach the campground parking lot. Leaving that cemetery felt like stepping away from a forgotten realm. Once we hit a semblance of a trail again, a fragile sense of relief settled over us. But it was short-lived. The path to the road was riddled with roots, slippery patches, and random branches that snagged at our clothes. Little cracks and snaps echoed in the brush, just enough to keep us on edge. We hurried along, willing ourselves not to think about the dark shapes dancing in our peripherals. Finally, we broke free of the tree line and spotted the asphalt up ahead. The sense of relief was almost overwhelming, like stumbling onto a lifeline in the middle of nowhere. But an uneasy vibe still trailed behind us, no matter how hard we tried to shake it. The light was fading fast, and the road itself looked empty in both directions. No cars, no people, nothing. Just a hush that felt downright eerie. That's where the first leg of our journey ended, with us stepping onto that road and peering into the early twilight. Looking back, I realized we had no clue how unsettling the next stretch would be. In the moment, though, we were just grateful to be out of the thick woods. Little did we know, that relief was about to dissolve quicker than we could have imagined. After stumbling out of the tree line, we reached this narrow asphalt road that was supposed to lead us back to the campground. And for a few fleeting moments, we were relieved. No more tripping over roots or scraping our arms on undergrowth. The wind seemed calmer, too, though I swear the air felt heavier than it had in the woods. With dusk rolling in, we figured we had maybe 3 miles to cover, tops. But it was eerily quiet. I mean, you'd expect at least a car or two to pass by in a park this size, even late in the day. Instead, we had this winding stretch of road all to ourselves. I remember my friend joking, "We're basically the only people left on Earth," and none of us cracked a real smile. We picked a direction, based on a ragged sign pointing toward the campground, and started walking, the sun melting into the horizon behind us. As we hiked along, the darkness deepened. The trees on either side of us stood like silent onlookers. Every so often, something would stir in the brush, maybe a small critter or a bird, but we never saw anything. That emptiness felt unnatural, like the park itself was waiting for something to happen. We'd covered about half the distance when we spotted the silhouettes. Up ahead, illuminated by the faint remnants of twilight, were at least 5 figures. They were just standing there in the middle of the road, as if they were waiting for us. Relief surged through me for a second, thankful that we weren't the only ones out there. My friend even waved, though none of them waved back. We moved closer, calling out a timid "hey" or two, hoping for some response. Nothing. They were close enough now that I should have been able to make out features, faces, hair color, clothing details. But it was like I could only see the general shape of them, as if the light was playing tricks. The weirdest part was that they didn't make a sound. No conversation, no footsteps shuffling on asphalt. They were just there, like placeholders. Then, without warning, they started to fade. One by one, they flickered in and out until all that remained was a vacant stretch of road. The 3 of us were rooted in place, trying to process what was happening. We weren't imagining this. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe our eyes were messing with us after the dim forest. Or maybe they'd just slipped away into the dark. But as we reached the exact spot where we'd seen them, it was clear there was nowhere to go. On one side, a sheer drop fell away into a valley. The other side was a jagged slope of rock that would have been nearly impossible to climb quietly, even in broad daylight. The asphalt itself looked undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of scuffling, not even a stray candy wrapper. Just empty road stretching off into the shadows. A cold sense of dread settled over us. We hung around for a minute, shining phone flashlights and calling out, but nobody answered. The idea of those figures just evaporating forced our tension up several notches. I couldn't tell if we'd witnessed something supernatural, or if my eyes were conspiring against me in the low light. Either way, it triggered a kind of primal fear I haven't felt too often in my life. We finally decided to press on, hearts thumping from the sudden shift in atmosphere. Every step from then on felt like it echoed a little too loudly. We kept glancing back, convinced we'd see the group again, trailing behind us, or maybe popping up ahead. But there was nothing. At one point, I caught a whiff of a faint odor, sort of earthy and decayed, but it was gone as soon as I noticed it. By then, we were moving faster than I'd ever hiked in my life. The final stretch to the campground felt like a fever dream, each of us expecting something horrible to lurch out of the darkness. When we finally caught sight of the campground sign, it was like stepping into another world, only there weren't any people there either. The entire place was disturbingly quiet save for the distant rustle of trees. Usually a state park campground has some buzz, campfires crackling, murmured conversations, maybe a dog barking. We got nothing. Our car was right where we left it, sitting in a patch of moonlit gravel. I can't describe how relieved I was to see it. We clambered inside, locking the doors more out of instinct than necessity. Who locks up in a lonely campground? But something about that night made every protective move feel justified. My friend gunned the ignition, and we peeled out, headlights pushing back the darkness a little. That entire drive out of the park, I kept expecting those figures to emerge from the trees or appear in the rearview mirror. Only once we hit the main highway did we dare speak about it in more than whispers. We tossed around ideas, mass hallucination, illusions caused by the fading light, or maybe some group of locals messing with us. Still, none of those explanations explained the silent disappearance act. Days later, every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those silhouettes flicker and vanish like they'd never existed at all. I've heard plenty of stories about weird sightings in the Appalachians, ghostly hikers, phantom lantern lights bobbing through the trees. But until that night, I brushed them off as campfire tales. Now, I'm not so sure. All I know is that something happened on that silent road, and I can't shake the idea that it was a glimpse into the unknown. That's the story of how a simple day trip to Holly River spiraled into a haunting mystery that continues to gnaw at me. Was it some lost echo of the park's past, or did we stumble into something far stranger than we were prepared to handle? Honestly, I still don't have an answer. But there's one thing I can say for sure. The image of those 5 figures dissolving in the twilight is going to stay with me. I guess not every twist in these old mountains needs a tidy explanation. Sometimes it's enough to know that the darkness holds more secrets than we can ever hope to understand. I'm writing this because every time I look back on my experiences out there, I end up pacing around my apartment, uneasy and restless. People love talking about the Appalachian Trail as if it's just scenic overlooks and friendly hikers, but I learned there's a lot more than meets the eye. Before I ever set foot on that route, I was the type of person who devoured paranormal stories. Something about the unknown always grabbed my attention. Maybe it's just human nature to chase mysteries. By the time I started planning my extended trek, I'd convinced myself that I was more prepared than most for whatever I'd find in those ancient mountains. The reality, completely different. I remember my first stretch near Blood Mountain. History loomed around every bend, not just from the Civil War sites, but from the remnants of tribal conflicts that went on long before European settlers showed up. The ground felt worn in a way that's tough to put into words, like it had absorbed centuries of voices. A couple of nights in, I decided to camp alone in a spot where the trees formed a thick canopy, letting in only patches of moonlight. The moment I unrolled my sleeping gear, I noticed that the usual night chorus, crickets, distant owls, had faded. There was an odd sensation of being watched from multiple angles. My mind started to wander, and I ended up lying awake far longer than I wanted. The strange part is, I was positive I spotted movements where there shouldn't have been any, silhouettes flitting at the periphery of my headlamp's glow. Once or twice, I had the distinct impression of a figure standing behind a distant trunk, dressed in something that didn't fit modern times. I never got a clear look, but that sense of stepping across some invisible threshold kept me wired until sunrise. A few weeks later, I ventured closer to Harper's Ferry, where you can literally walk among the traces of the Civil War trenches. One late afternoon, as the light shifted from gold to a dull gray, I saw a person in old-style military gear drifting along a sunken path. My brain tried to rationalize. Maybe it's a reenactor, maybe I was exhausted, but the person, or whatever it was, vanished almost instantly. The spot fell silent, like everything around had decided to pause. For a second I questioned if I was alone in that corridor of battered earth. It left me on edge for the next several days, scanning every ridgeline in case something else appeared. But nothing compares to the night a bear and I had our awkward confrontation. I'd rigged up a hammock between 2 sturdy trunks and dozed off, lulled by the distant rustling. At some unknown hour, a firm prod against my back startled me awake. I reacted without thinking, twisting around and striking with my hand. I connected with fur and realized in horror it was a bear's muzzle. Adrenaline shot through me as I waited for it to decide if I was more trouble than I was worth. Instead, it crashed off through the brush, leaving me stunned and trying to slow my breathing. The rest of that evening, every single noise made me tense up, braced for a second round that, thankfully, never came. Funny thing is, when I mention this to people, they usually fixate on the bear encounter. They don't realize that animals, wild as they might be, don't compare to the unsettling presence that seems embedded in parts of this trail. That feeling of history refusing to let go, those fleeting glimpses of things wearing outdated clothes, the heavy atmosphere around certain places. It's all there, woven into the land. I'd tell myself these experiences were just the product of fatigue. Maybe I'd just been reading too many ghost stories. Yet something nagged at me, like I'd stumbled onto a realm where the past occasionally slips through the cracks. Later, in Pennsylvania, I'd discover what true dread can feel like. That, however, is a story for another post, one that still keeps me alert at odd hours, replaying every step I took through that long, dark night. I thought I'd seen the worst of the trail. Run-ins with spooky silhouettes and a half-asleep confrontation with a bear had me convinced I was prepared for anything. Turns out, Pennsylvania wanted to prove me wrong. After crossing the state line, I remember feeling oddly optimistic. The weather was pleasant enough, and I decided to sleep under the stars rather than set up any shelter. The sky was so clear earlier that evening, and I wanted to experience the open air for once. I laid out my sleeping pad and got comfy in my bag, surrounded by trees and that faint hum of nighttime insects. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime past midnight, I woke up with my heart thumping. The night had gone dead silent, which rattled me. Normally, you'd at least hear a hooting owl or wind rustling the branches. Instead, a thin, eerie whine reverberated all around. It was so soft, like it was trying not to exist, but it also seemed inescapable. Every instinct told me I shouldn't remain there. My breathing felt tight, and the air felt heavier than usual, as if some invisible presence had crept in and settled on top of me. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that it might just be the wind through the leaves or some small animal. Yet the whine didn't change pitch, didn't shift direction, didn't do anything I'd label as normal. The dread in the pit of my stomach wasn't something I could shrug off. Within minutes, I was shoving gear back into my pack, fumbling for my headlamp. It took every ounce of willpower not to panic and run blindly through the dark. The moment I found the trail markers and started moving, the heaviness slowly eased. After maybe half a mile, the sensation broke, like stepping out of a dense fog. The noise faded into nothingness, and I stood there, leaning on a tree, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to turn back, search for some logical explanation. The rest of me argued that I should get as far from that spot as possible. In the end, I kept going. Even now, I haven't made sense of what happened, or what was possibly lurking in that empty patch of forest. A few days later, a storm caught me and a group of through hikers near Mount Rogers. Rain hammered the metal roof of a simple shelter, thunder rolling across the sky. We were soaked, shivering, and half-starved. Someone remembered that a local pizza place would deliver to the parking lot if you sweet-talked them enough. The idea of hot food and maybe a six-pack had us pooling whatever money we had left. After a tense wait, lightning flickering in the distance, we spotted headlights. Naturally, we figured our food had arrived. Several of us shuffled out into the downpour, layered in soaked clothes, boots caked in mud, hair plastered to our faces. We must have looked like a nightmare. The driver saw us coming and slammed on the high beams. Tires screeched, reverse lights glowed bright red, and the van spun around so fast we all stood there in confusion. We watched the vehicle vanish back down the road, fishtailing like it was desperate to escape. We exchanged baffled looks, water dripping down our faces, and laughed nervously. Some of the group started joking. Maybe we seemed like forest ghouls or something. 5 minutes later, like clockwork, a different car pulled up, and this time, the driver hopped out, completely unfazed. Apparently he was the real pizza guy, used to hikers in all their rain-soaked glory. He handed over hot pizza boxes, a few cans of cheap beer, and chuckled about us looking like zombies. I can only guess what the first driver's story would be afterward, how a band of unholy creatures approached his van in the middle of nowhere at night. In those moments, I realized that the Appalachian Trail doesn't just feed on spooky legends. Sometimes, genuine comedy and confusion overshadow the fear. Yet, for all the laughs we shared over that botched pizza delivery, I still had the memory of that unsettling whine in Pennsylvania fresh in my head. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd only scratched the surface. The trail has this way of revealing its secrets when you least expect it. 1 minute you're joking around, dripping wet, begging for food. The next, you're bolting from an unexplainable force in the dead of night. Even now, I look back at Pennsylvania and feel a pang of discomfort. Whatever I sensed out there, whatever generated that unearthly noise, made me think there are places along the trail better left alone, maybe forever. And yet part of me can't resist the pull to keep exploring, half expecting to stumble onto some ancient mystery that refuses to stay buried. Guess that's the real paradox of the Appalachian Trail. It draws you in with beauty, then leaves you with questions that linger night after night. I was closing in on Duncannon, feeling that mix of exhaustion and excitement that comes when you're too far gone to turn around, but not quite close enough to celebrate. About 10 miles out, I spotted a small group of older women huddled around a couple of picnic tables near the trail. They waved me over with warm smiles, so I joined them to rest my legs a bit. They asked if I was a through hiker, and seemed genuinely thrilled about my progress. We traded a few stories. I told them where I started, how many states I'd already trudged through. It felt like your average friendly chatter until they asked where I was sleeping that night. Soon as I mentioned some older shelter a few miles shy of town, their energy shifted. One of them said, "You should really head into Duncannon tonight," while another repeated the advice, adding nothing else, just the same warning. None of them spelled out why, and I remember thinking, are they worried about the weather or something? But their eyes had this urgency, like they knew something I didn't. I tried to press them for details, but they brushed it off, insisting it'd be better if I pushed on to town. My pack was heavy, and my feet were screaming at me, so heading all the way in felt like an extra challenge. Their unease was contagious, though. As I said my goodbyes, that tension they carried clung to me like a damp chill. By late afternoon, I found myself turning off the main stretch of the Appalachian Trail, following a steep side path toward the shelter. The slope was trickier than I expected, with old roots and loose stones that had me stumbling more than once. Overhead, the light was already starting to fade behind thick branches. Normally, I'd be okay with a few hours of dusk hiking, but something about that place just felt heavy. Eventually, I reached two battered structures that I knew from my guidebook were built by Earl Schaffer. He was basically AT royalty, having been the first person to ever hike the entire trail in one go. The shelters looked ancient, sagging in spots, and the musty boards gave off a whiff of age and rot. Nearby was a new shelter under construction, and even from a distance, I noticed carved faces on the beam ends. They peered out in a way I couldn't quite describe, like silent observers in the dying light. I could have stayed in the half-finished shelter, but it seemed even more unsettling with those carved heads, so I stuck to one of the old ones. Inside, the shelter's floor was just round logs placed side by side, barely lifted off the ground. It made for a pretty uneven sleeping surface. I figured I'd seen worse. This was the AT after all. But something about that rickety setup gave me an odd sense of discomfort. I tried to focus on other things. Next day's mileage, where I'd get water, a possible 0 day in Duncannon. But whenever I paused, that prickly awareness returned, like I wasn't alone. I kept glancing around, seeing nothing but old wood, leaves, and a few spiders skittering in the corners. I made dinner quickly, more to keep my hands busy than anything. Every so often, a gust of wind would whistle through the beams, and the shelter groaned like it had a voice of its own. My mind flicked back to the women at the picnic tables. Why were they so insistent I shouldn't be here? The question nagged at me, but without a concrete reason, I brushed it off as local superstition or overprotection. Night fell harder than usual, it seemed. The woods beyond the shelter entrance looked like a solid wall of black. My headlamp beam danced around, catching the edges of rocks and roots outside, but I couldn't shake the weirdness. I tried to sleep, but my senses stayed on high alert. Sometimes a crack of a branch snapped me awake, or a rustle of movement made me think there was someone, or something, lurking beyond the circle of light. When morning finally arrived, the relief I felt was intense. Packing up, I almost sprinted up that trail, my body protesting the sudden climb, but my mind demanding we get moving. With each step, the weight of the place seemed to lessen, replaced by fresh air and the promise of Duncannon's comforts. Still, I couldn't completely shake a lingering unease, like I'd just crawled out from under a dark cloud. It wasn't until I reached town, found a phone, and updated my mail drop contact that I got slapped in the face with the real story. I mentioned that shelter, offhandedly describing it as seriously creepy. That's when she told me about the two hikers. They'd been southbounders, having a friendly chat with a random bar patron in Duncannon. Later that night, this same patron had followed them to that very shelter, waited until they were asleep, and murdered them. Hearing it made my stomach twist. replaying every odd vibe I'd felt, every unsettling sound during the night. Those women at the picnic tables had tried to warn me, but they couldn't bring themselves to say why out loud. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, knowing now what happened in those walls. It was more than just an old shelter. It was a crime scene, a place stained by something monstrous. If I had known, would I still have slept there? Maybe not. But the thought of it being so close to where two people lost their lives shifted the trail in my mind. The wilderness wasn't just bears and storms. It could hold human darkness too. And I had just walked right into it. I came back to that stretch of the trail a few years later. I hadn't really planned on returning. There was a part of me that wanted to avoid that entire area after learning what had gone down at the old shelters. But life and my hiking routes had a funny way of circling back on themselves. Before I knew it, I was standing at the same cutoff from the main trail, peering down the slope with this knot in my stomach. The trees here looked familiar, yet different, maybe older or scarred by storms. Sunlight trickled through the canopy in thin beams, and a low breeze made the branches sway. I swear it felt like the forest was reminding me, we remember what happened here. Going down that path, I half expected to see the two old shelters just as they'd been. My memory was vivid, those ramshackle logs, the musty smell, the new shelter mid-construction with the carved faces. But when I reached the bottom, I was greeted by an entirely changed scene. The two ancient structures had been torn out, no trace but a few piles of splintered wood near the edge of the clearing. Instead, the new shelter stood proudly in their place, fully completed. The carved faces I'd glimpsed years ago were still there, only now smoothed by weather, or maybe by countless hikers running their hands along them. They seemed less like art and more like watchful eyes. I hesitated, feeling a swirl of relief that the murderous old shelters were gone, mixed with a weird nostalgia for the original version of the place, even if it had been dangerously creepy. As I moved closer, I noticed someone sitting on the newly built porch, sipping from a battered canteen. He wore a bandana and looked like he'd seen a lot of trail miles. When he looked up, I nodded a greeting, and he waved me over. We got to talking, as hikers do. Turns out he'd thru-hiked the trail a few years back, and had come out for a weekend getaway. It wasn't long before we drifted into the subject of the area's grim history. Apparently, there was a formal dedication ceremony once the new shelter was finished, and from what he'd heard, Earl Schaffer himself had been there, only to be brushed off or overshadowed by certain officials. Folks who didn't get the depth of his contribution, or maybe just didn't care. Hearing that made me bristle. Earl had literally shaped part of the trail's legacy, these shelters, the story of the first thru hike, and it hurt to imagine him being sidelined. The conversation took a darker turn when we ventured into the topic of those murders. My companion knew about them too, of course. Everyone who's hiked this area for long enough picks up the rumors, if not the exact details. But he also mentioned how, despite the tragedy, folks in town tried to move on. The new shelter was supposed to symbolize a fresh start, a safe space for hikers passing through. Only, he said, some people believed the land itself still felt tainted, as though the violence of that night hadn't just vanished when the old shelters got ripped out. "Have you felt it?" he asked me, eyes locked onto mine. "That heavy quiet?" I gave a slow nod, remembering the sensation of dread from my own first night here. We both fell into silence, broken only by the rustle of wind and the distant babble of a creek. Eventually, he packed up and left, heading back toward town. I hung around a bit, taking in the new shelter. It looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, just sturdy beams, a proper roof, and enough space to fit a handful of hikers. But those carved faces unnerved me. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn they were almost aware, as if they'd seen more than they let on, listening for footsteps in the night. Later on, I found myself walking north again. The trail was peaceful, the kind of gentle climb that usually empties my mind of worries. Only this time, my thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened there. I wondered if a fresh coat of wood and a brand new name could really erase the memory of two hikers who'd never made it out. A piece of me doubted it, A few weeks down the line, I came across Pierce Pond Shelter in Maine. Beautiful spot, picturesque pond, vibrant autumn colors. But the instant I got there, I felt a pang of that same uneasy tension I'd experienced in Pennsylvania. It wasn't rational. There was no recorded tragedy I knew of, no creeping murderer lurking behind a pine tree. Still, the place had this hush, like it was waiting for something. I tried shaking it off, chalking it up to hiker paranoia or lingering trauma from that other shelter. Yet, as the sun dipped below the pines, the atmosphere felt suffocating. Every rustle outside set my nerves on edge. That's when I started to wonder if it was me, if I was carrying this darkness from shelter to shelter, replaying it in every unfamiliar corner of the trail. The thought alone was enough to keep me wide awake, scanning for silhouettes in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off, but not peacefully. In the morning, the chill still clung to me. I realized it's not as simple as a single terrible event in one place, or some new construction replacing old bones. The trail might be full of kind souls and breathtaking sights, but it can also trap echoes of the worst moments experienced by those who walked it. The deeper truth is that no matter how many signs we put up or improvements we make, history has a nasty habit of haunting whatever ground it clings to. I left Pierce Pond Shelter feeling a little more shaken, a little more aware of how quickly these woods can go from comforting to unnerving. And as I hiked on, the thought kept circling in my head. The real danger out here isn't always the wildlife or the elements. Sometimes it's the people you cross paths with and the echoes they leave behind, long after they're gone. Be careful out there. I'd planned on taking it easy that evening, maybe practice a few fishing knots, or help Grandpa Morley tidy up the workshop. Instead, a couple of friends, Ray and Kelsey, coaxed me into one last round of our favorite hide-and-seek style game. It was something we'd concocted years ago, chasing each other through every nook and cranny of the Appalachians behind Grandpa's homestead. Funny how you can grow up around these hills and still feel like you've barely scratched the surface of what's out there. The house sits at the base of a ridge that rises into dense hardwood forests. Grandpa always said the land has its own memory, that every gust of wind and snap of twigs might be a signal if you listen closely enough. I laughed it off whenever he got too mystical, but tonight I was starting to see where he might have been coming from. The three of us were in the yard, the western sky burning orange where the sun dropped behind the ridgeline. Kelsey decided she'd be it this time, so Ray and I scampered toward the slope. We both had camouflage jackets, more fashion statement than functional gear, but I like to think it helped us blend in. The plan was to outsmart Kelsey by moving uphill. She'd never guess we'd take the steeper path. Or so we thought. We crested that slope, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet the forest had become. Usually this time of evening, you can hear crickets winding up for their nighttime chorus, maybe an owl calling in the distance. That night, it felt like everything paused, waiting. Ray and I tucked ourselves into a shallow dip in the ground, just behind a line of scraggly bushes. We had a clear view of the yard, though it was getting dim. Kelsey's flashlight beam danced across the grass below, and we congratulated ourselves on the perfect hiding spot. All we had to do was lie low until she gave up. Easy enough. A moment later, a low, rhythmic pulse reached us, like a drumbeat echoing from far off. Ray's head jerked up. I glanced at him, wondering if he felt it too, that buzzing in the pit of my stomach. Drums in this part of the mountains? Maybe a local gathering, though it made zero sense for it to suddenly start after dusk. The sound grew. The beat became something more than a lone drum, chanting or singing, weaving in. And accompanying everything, a melody that shouldn't fit any of it. A high, keening note, reminiscent of bagpipes. That unexpected note stirred something protective in me, like I needed to stand up and figure out who was out there. Except, stepping forward was the last thing I wanted to do. The music peaked, reverberating through the trees, each note rippling across the slope. Ray and we just stared at each other, neither wanting to speak out loud. Even whispering felt too risky, as if we'd draw unwanted attention. My lungs begged for a deep breath, but I tried not to make a sound. Then it died away, gone in half a heartbeat. The sudden lack of noise rang in my ears more than the drumbeat did. I couldn't bear another second of stillness. Ray must have felt the same because he jerked his head downhill, eyes wide. We both sprang up, stumbling over that ridge. Gravity did half the work, sending us skidding down faster than we intended. A root snagged Ray's foot, nearly toppling him. I grabbed his sleeve, and we both regained balance long enough to lurch down into the yard. Kelsey didn't need an explanation. She stood frozen near the house's floodlight, face pale with confusion. Grandpa stepped onto the porch, an old lantern in one hand, eyebrows knit. We didn't offer much beyond a frantic, "We heard something weird." Even saying that felt like an understatement. Inside the house, we slammed the door behind us, hearts hammering. Grandpa told us to sit, voice firm but calm, and started asking questions. Ray tried to describe the chanting and the bagpipes, while I stared out the window, half expecting more noise to erupt from the hills. But everything beyond the floodlit yard was black, mute. Eventually, Grandpa checked his radio to see if there were any announcements. Some festival, a big group camping, a local event that might explain away the noise. Nothing came through. He frowned, as if something he'd worried about was stepping into reality. He suggested we all stick close, even though part of me wanted to bolt for my truck and drive into the nearest town. We ended up huddling in the living room, not saying much. Each time the house creaked with night settling in, we jerked our heads toward the windows. Part of me thought I was overreacting. The other part said I couldn't be too careful. At one point, Kelsey started describing how it sounded almost ceremonial. Ray kept mentioning the bagpipes, how out of place they felt in these mountains. Grandpa just listened in silence, like he was adding up bits of a puzzle we couldn't see. And so we waited for dawn, adrenaline coursing so hard that sleep didn't stand a chance. Whatever we heard out there, it didn't feel like an accidental jam session. It had the determined rhythm of something bigger, something we weren't meant to stumble upon. I glanced through the window one more time, across that slope where the silhouette of bare branches seemed to watch us back. The night had only just begun, and I was afraid it wasn't done revealing whatever secrets lay in those woods. Morning light had a way of making the previous night feel like a fever dream. But when I opened my eyes, the knot in my gut told me it wasn't just an overactive imagination. Ray was already awake, pacing in front of the fireplace. Kelsey sipped coffee at the window, staring off at the slope where we'd heard that eerie music. The house felt tense, like we were all braced for whatever might come next. Grandpa Morley was digging through his old field notebooks, scattering them across the kitchen table. He murmured to himself as he flipped pages, sometimes tapping a map he'd pinned down with an empty coffee cup. Finally, he called us over. "This area right here," he pointed at a forested patch just beyond the ridge. "I've heard stories about folks finding strange footprints, hearing unexplainable sounds. Never had solid proof, but no shortage of rumors." Ray wanted answers. He kept talking about how that chanting still echoed in his ears. Kelsey looked as though she wanted to crawl under a blanket and forget everything. But Grandpa said if we wanted peace of mind, we had to see what was out there in the daylight. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but curiosity gnawed at me. The only way to settle my nerves was to confront whatever was lurking in those trees. We followed the same path as the night before, only this time, sunbeams cut through the canopy. The forest felt awake now, birds calling overhead, the smell of wet leaves underfoot. My boots squelched in the soft soil. About 20 minutes in, we spotted footprints in the mud near an old game trail. More than one set, too. Some were big enough that I wondered if a whole group had come through. Kelsey knelt down, tracing the edges with her fingertips. She didn't say a word, but her expression told me she was unsettled. As we pressed deeper, a low clearing opened up. In the center were stones stacked in a wide circle. The ground was littered with scorched branches, as if a fire had burned there recently. I kicked at a pile of ash. uncovering what might have been animal bones. Nearby, Ray found shredded fabric snagged on a sharp branch, checkered like tartan. The breath caught in my throat. Bagpipes, a Scottish pattern, and those drum rhythms. None of it added up, but it sure felt connected. Before we could piece things together, that same beat thrummed in the distance. All three of us froze, and every nerve I had went on high alert. The chanting returned, and with it came a deeper, resonating drumbeat that rattled through the trees. We ducked behind an uprooted trunk, peering over as shadows flickered beyond the bushes. I saw multiple figures moving, at least 5 or 6, too many to count accurately. One carried what looked like a bagpipe under an arm. Another brandished a tall staff decorated with dangling bits of cloth or feathers. It felt like we'd trespassed on a hidden ceremony. My pulse roared in my head, urging me to get moving. Ray tugged my jacket, and we bolted. Adrenaline drove us as we crashed through the undergrowth. The chanting didn't fade right away. In fact, for a moment it seemed to chase us, echoing in all directions. We burst out onto the slope behind the homestead, nearly stumbling over each other. Grandpa was there, a rifle propped against his hip. He took one look at our faces and told us to get inside. Over the next hour, we told him about the footprints, the circle of stones, the scrap of tartan, and the silhouettes with bagpipes in hand. He listened, and at the end, he nodded like it confirmed a rumor he'd once heard. That generations ago, certain families who settled these hills mixed cultures, Scottish and Native American, keeping old traditions alive in the most secluded spots. There was no telling if they meant harm. Grandpa planned to notify a ranger station, see if they'd heard of any suspicious gatherings. But I think we all sensed the same foreboding truth. Whatever goes on in these woods after dark might not welcome outsiders. We'd seen enough to know we didn't belong out there at night. When dusk rolled around, we stayed close to the house, porch lights blazing. Kelsey kept her eyes on the ridge, looking for any flicker of firelight or movement among the trees. Ray sat with me in the living room, occasionally glancing at the window. Every so often, I half expected those drums to sound again. Even if they stayed silent, I knew they were only a heartbeat away, tucked in the deep pockets of the Appalachians. We had a name for the fear now, but it didn't make it any less real, and it didn't keep me from wondering if, next time, we might not get away so easily. I've always said these Appalachian mountains were in my bloodstream, a legacy from my grandfather in Boone County, West Virginia. Every time I roll down the highway and see those steep ridges rising in the distance, something inside me sparks to life, like part of me recognizes home. This time, though, that welcome feeling came bundled with an unsettling undercurrent I couldn't quite explain. The plan was simple enough: drive from Michigan to New York City, pick up my friend who needed extra help traveling, and head back to Detroit. I'd done cross-country treks before, so I didn't expect anything beyond the usual long-haul hassle. The first few hours were honestly too quiet. I got pulled over in Ohio for a busted headlight, and even though the trooper was polite, my nerves still buzzed the rest of the night. The idea of sleeping in my car at a rest stop sounded okay at first, but every shuffle of footsteps outside made me sit up and peer into the dark. Eventually I dozed off, but it was a half-baked sort of sleep that left me feeling ragged. By mid-morning, I was back on the road, cutting through Pennsylvania and drinking in the misty peaks off in the distance. Something about those valleys always puts me on edge and at ease all at once, like I belong there, but I also know the land can turn dangerous without warning. The hours ticked by, traffic thickened, and soon I was in the sprawling chaos of New York City. After a painful search for parking, I finally spotted my friend. She hopped into my cramped PT Cruiser, and I was eager to leave the city behind. There's a hyper-awareness that creeps in when I'm stuck in that much congestion. Too many headlights, too many people, and not enough personal space. We were both relieved to point the car west again. Darkness wasn't far off by the time we made decent progress. We'd agreed to pull into a large store parking lot somewhere in western Pennsylvania for the night, somewhere bright enough and busy enough that we wouldn't feel vulnerable. That's where things started getting weird. I rolled into a Walmart lot that was mostly empty except for a handful of cars clustered near the entrance. But parked a little too far out were two vehicles that gave me a sour feeling. Dark-tinted windows, engines idling like they were waiting on something. I tried to wave off my own paranoia, but every time I glanced over, one of the cars seemed to shift closer. My friend noticed it too. She nudged my arm and whispered, "Is it just me, or are they edging toward us?" Her voice was shaky, and it confirmed I wasn't imagining things. I felt tension coil in my gut. We decided to bail. No point in testing our luck. Neither of us wanted to be cornered by strangers in the middle of the night. Pulling out of that lot, I could feel my hands clenching the steering wheel. Driving away eased the pressure only slightly. The next rest stop we aimed for was tucked between shadowy ridges, nearly deserted. My headlights swept over scattered parking spots, and there in the corner was a white Jeep. Newish model, tinted windows, not a soul in sight around it. In the back of my head, I was screaming at myself that I was just being jittery, but I couldn't shake the thought, what if it followed us from the lot? It seemed too coincidental. My friend leaned forward, trying to see if anyone was inside, and that quiet question hung in the air. Could it be the same one? We didn't linger long enough to find out. I swung the car around and got back on the highway, half expecting the Jeep's headlights to pop up in my mirror. For a while, it was just darkness and winding roads, the trees crowding in on either side. My friend and I didn't talk much. We were both in our own heads. Every distant glimmer of lights behind us made my muscles tighten. A few times I caught myself speeding, pushing my old PT Cruiser harder than I should have, just wanting to be around other people, bright lights, safety. Maybe it was overblown fear, or maybe not. Eventually we spotted another big box store off the highway, a place that was open all night. We drifted into the lot, found a spot neither too hidden nor too exposed, and tried to settle in. My friend reclined her seat, fiddling with her phone, and I leaned against the door, letting my eyes close. The adrenaline buzz was fading, replaced by sheer exhaustion. The plan was simple: get some rest, wake up, and push on at dawn. That's all we needed, right? But a nagging alarm kept sounding in the back of my mind. I couldn't help imagining a set of headlights rolling in beside us again. I'd always prided myself on having good instincts, especially on the road, and something was shouting at me to stay alert. Maybe the night was messing with my head, maybe it was the mountain air, but I couldn't settle. I just kept checking the rearview mirror and scanning the corners of the lot, half conscious, waiting for a sign that everything was about to unravel. Looking back, I should have known I wasn't going to get a peaceful rest. The real trouble was just around the corner, and a part of me sensed it even then. The mountains have a way of holding secrets close, and that night, it felt like I was driving straight into one. I'd been through my fair share of late-night drives, but none that left me quite this tense. We'd found another big parking lot, a large store glowing in the distance like some lifeline, and I figured we could finally try to rest. My friend was nodding off in the passenger seat, leaning her head against the window. My eyes felt heavy, but every time I let them close, I'd jolt awake at the faintest hint of movement in my mirrors. At first, the lot seemed almost peaceful, only a smattering of cars, plenty of overhead lights, and the steady hum of night shift employees hauling carts around. I tried to tell myself we'd been imagining things earlier, that those suspicious vehicles were just random folks passing through. Then I spotted headlights drifting in from the far side of the lot, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened again. A white Jeep Compass glided across the asphalt and parked right next to us. There were at least a dozen other open spaces, so why pick the one so close? I glanced to my left, and there he was, the same driver who'd been lingering in my memory, like a fleeting shadow I couldn't quite get rid of. He was young but worn somehow, his gaze heavy and unflinching. A cold energy rolled off him, making my nerves flare. Part of me wanted to brush it off, assume I was just stuck in my own fears. But the longer we locked eyes, the more certain I became that this wasn't random. My friend must have sensed it too. She snapped awake, following my stare. I heard her mutter something like, "Not again." And that was all the push I needed. I cranked the ignition, yanked the gear shift into drive, and tore out of there. The wheels squealed, echoing across the mostly empty lot. I almost expected the Jeep to remain behind, some bizarre coincidence put to rest. Instead, the headlights came to life and stuck to our bumper. I felt a jolt of adrenaline rush through my limbs as I realized we were being followed yet again. The highway ramp was up ahead, and I gunned it, hoping I could leave him behind in the open stretches of road. But once I merged, those lights were still there, unwavering. Mile after mile, I tried to ignore the tightness in my chest, the nagging thought that I'd let this go too far. Yet I couldn't slow down, not with that Jeep trailing me like it was locked on. Ahead, the mountains rose against the sky, dark silhouettes capped by faint moonlight. We thundered onto an exit, hoping to lose him in the twists and turns of back roads. My friend pulled out her phone, trying to chart a route that might confuse any pursuer. We zigzagged through narrow highways, winding through steep valleys and lonely clusters of trees, the path weaving in a dizzying snake-like pattern. Each time I dared glance back, those headlights burned in the darkness, unshaken by the hairpin curves. Exhaustion gnawed at me, and I wondered how long we could keep this up without making a critical mistake. The roads were almost deserted, lined with battered guardrails and the endless silhouettes of sloping ridges. Everything in me wanted to stop, to catch a moment's calm, but my instincts hollered that would be a terrible idea with this creep hanging on our tail. Then, in a flash of brilliance or desperation, I'm still not sure which, I yanked the wheel onto a hidden side route. The Jeep sped past our turn, its taillights flaring red as it tried to brake too late. A wave of relief washed over me when I realized we might have slipped his grasp. I continued down this narrow road until we reached an aging wooden sign pointing to a smaller town. Streetlights became more frequent. The black outline of the mountains gave way to a dimly lit main street, and for the first time in hours, I let myself breathe. A fast food place, maybe the only one open that early, glowed at the edge of the road. We pulled in, found a spot between work trucks and local cars. The safety of other humans moving around was enough to let the tension in my muscles ease a bit. My friend and I were so drained, we just collapsed against the seats, windows still rolled up tight. After so many panicked miles, the distant hum of a drive-through speaker and the smell of stale French fries felt like a blessing. When the sun finally started creeping over the ragged skyline of mountains, I stirred. My neck ached from sleeping at a weird angle. Outside, life was picking up, people stepping in and out, an elderly couple walking their dog along the sidewalk. No white Jeep in sight. You'd think I would have been relieved, but an odd sense of dread tugged at me. Had we really lost him, or was he just biding his time? I checked my phone, half expecting messages from family asking where I was, but it stayed eerily silent. The air felt thick with unresolved tension. My friend and I ordered some breakfast, greasy but hot, just to ground ourselves in something normal. Every so often we glanced out the windows, scanning each vehicle that pulled through. Nothing suspicious, yet neither of us could fully shake the lingering paranoia. It felt like we'd gone through some twisted rite of passage in those mountains. By the time we climbed back into the car, the morning sunlight was streaming in, almost too bright against the tiredness in our faces. A part of me wished we could head straight home without another break, but I knew I had to keep an eye out for that Jeep, as though it might materialize again. The realization was chilling. A simple trip to help a friend had morphed into this frantic late-night chase. Sure, maybe we were both wound too tight. Maybe the stranger was just some random jerk on a power trip, but I couldn't shake a deeper suspicion that he was dangerous, and that under the vast sky of Appalachia, anything could happen. We buckled up and drove off, leaving that small town in the rearview mirror. Each mile of highway felt both relieving and nerve-wracking, as if something could pop out any second. By the time we found a route that led back toward Detroit, The mountains were starting to fade behind us. I couldn't help thinking about how, despite my deep respect for those old ridges, I was leaving with a new, grim awareness of the shadows they can hide. I took a final look at the looming outlines in the mirror, imagining that white Jeep hidden somewhere in the valleys, lying in wait. Even if I never found out who was behind the wheel, that night changed me. I used to think of these roads like a second home, a place of comfort and belonging. Now, a knot of tension insisted that some things are better left alone, and that wandering too far into unknown territory can lead to horrors you can't always outrun.
So, for the context of this story, this was about 10 years ago. I was about 13 the first time my parents took me and my little brother to Disneyland for the first time, and it literally was the happiest place on earth. Me and my brother, who was only 10 at the time, adored the rides, the fireworks, the food, just the magic in general. It was my favorite family vacation we had ever taken. However, I seemed to get a lot of negative attention. I was tall for my age and already well developed, so I would get stares from older men. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I overheard my dad mention something to my mom about a father with 2 children staring at my ass in the line of a ride. This barely concerned me though, considering where we were at. On the 3rd day of our vacation, my parents were so worn out, they didn't want to go to the park anymore. I begged and pleaded with them to allow me and my brother to head off on our own, and finally, my mother talked my father into allowing us to go and explore Disneyland by ourselves. Taking my brother firmly by the hand, we walked to the park entrance and experienced a newfound sense of glorious freedom as we walked through the gate by ourselves for the first time. It was almost like seeing it all over again in a new light. Like I said, I was completely oblivious to most things, since I had grown up in a small town in relative safety. I was a nerd and nobody ever paid attention to me at my middle school, so I didn't expect them to pay attention to me anywhere else. I remember getting in line for Pirates of the Caribbean, and I felt someone else get in line behind me and my brother, and he was standing very, very close. Close enough to almost be touching my brother. Since my brother has autism, and I didn't want him freaking out because someone was so close, I decided to play the sacrificial lamb and stepped between him and my brother. However, this just made him step even closer, practically pressing up against my body. I felt uncomfortable, but I chose to ignore him as we got closer to the front of the ride. Stepping into the boat, I stuck my baby brother on the side and slunk into the middle seat. From behind me, I could hear a commotion and someone slid in next to me, the creepy guy who kept pressing up against me. It didn't take him long to continue getting in my personal space, his hand practically touching my upper thigh. I was a shy 13-year-old, and he was a grown-ass man. How the hell was I going to try and keep him off me? He would have crushed me like a bug. So I tried to huddle next to my brother and enjoy the ride. As it went on, the guy's hand went from a relaxed stance to a firm grip, his thumb digging into my skin. I wanted to cry and vomit all at the same time as my oblivious brother watched the animatronic pirates. As the ride was getting to a standstill, the guy finally turns to me and gives me a smile. At least, I think it was a smile. It was super dark in the ride. It could have been a snarl for all I knew. He mentioned something about seeing me and my brother around the park, that we looked like we were lost, and that he could give us a behind-the-scenes tour of the park since he was an off-duty park employee. He said he worked for the Tower of Terror over in California Adventure. I politely declined, and the guy finally lets go of my thigh, but kept his leg securely glued to my own. I couldn't get out of that damn boat fast enough. Heart in my throat and my brother in tow, we got out of the ride and burst onto the busy street. I didn't know what to do except get away from the creep, but he tailed me and my brother for another 10 minutes. Finally, I realized what my 13-year-old terrified self had to do. I marched up to the closest park employee, a young, short woman with blonde hair, and started telling her about the events of the last half hour. I tried to point out the man, but apparently as soon as he saw that we were going to talk to the staff, he hightailed it out of there. She reassured me that they would do everything in their power to try and find the guy, but she couldn't make any promises. We were asked to go to security and not to walk back to our hotel alone, so I could give a description of the man, which I was unfortunately unable to do because of the dimness of the ride. They called our parents, who were visibly shaken but glad that we were okay. The rest of our vacation went off without a hitch, but my brother and I were kept by our parents' side the entire time. Even when we went back when I was 16 and my mother kept me glued to her hip the entire time, it was only when we went back when I was 19 that she allowed my brother and I to wander off again. By this point, me being my loud-mouthed, swearing self you now see before you. I guess these occurrences aren't uncommon in the park, unfortunately, and for the sake of those who are victims of something like this, I pray that you speak up, fight, do whatever you can to get away from people like that man. And to the man on the Pirates ride, let's never meet again, you pedophile.
First off, I love my family very much. I have 3 aunts, 2 uncles, 4 cousins that are very close to me. So of course, when my mother won the trip to Walt Disney World for 10, we knew we had to make a big family trip. We paid for my Aunt Bonnie and her husband Ron, Aunt Jean, Cousin Audrey, Uncle Bruce, Uncle Dan, and Aunt Linda. But we invited everyone else to come if they could pay. My family is comprised of doctors, engineers, and for God's sakes, my grandfather is an actual rocket scientist. They could absolutely pay. We planned ahead and all got on a flight that landed in Orlando at about the same time, and we got adjoining rooms at the hotel. Altogether, we took up 5 rooms. Even though all my cousins are old enough to drink, Nathan, Audrey, and I played with the doors that connected our family's rooms. It was late when we got to Florida. We didn't account for the hour time change. So my aunts, uncles, and mom, who were all older, went to bed fairly soon after we checked into our rooms. But my cousins, my sister, and I are all young and in a Disneyland hotel without parental supervision. I'll admit, we acted a little childish, but I felt happier than I had in a long time. We swam and played through the pool. My cousin Nathan got a luggage cart and raced us down the hallways like a skateboard. We took a whole bunch of soaps from the maid cart, and we didn't get caught. Sarah was being a bit of a mother hen, but she eventually lightened up and had fun too. We were all laughing so hard that Audrey wet herself. She excused herself to go change, but when she came back, she looked different. It's getting late, and Sarah's right. We're all being a little rowdy, Audrey mumbled. I think it's about time we go to bed. I checked my phone to see what time it actually was, and I think everyone else checked too. A big 12:17 a.m. glared at me. Whoa, yeah, we better get back to our room, Nathan said. He pushed us back to our respective rooms, and we vowed to meet up for the free breakfast downstairs at 8:30. My sister and I got in, put on our pajamas, and fell asleep, and didn't wake up until 7:56. I woke up to the sound of my sister screeching to my mother that she didn't have enough time to put her makeup on, and she wouldn't be joining us for breakfast. My mom was trying to convince her that she looked fine, and their family, and don't care what she looked like. I got up and started my morning routine. Who you trying to impress, Goofy? Oh my god, Mom, no. I started laughing quietly with toothpaste still in my mouth. What if there's a cute guy down there and he's supposed to be my soulmate, but we don't get to spend the day at the park and start our relationship because I look like one of those stupid monster things Caitlin watches on TV, my sister cried. I started laughing harder because I imagined Goofy looming behind my sister while sitting at the breakfast table. "Don't laugh at me, just go on without me, I'll catch up." She was insistent and my mom eventually gave up. I sat down on the nice couch in the room and waited for my mom to finish getting ready. We finally got down to the breakfast area at 8:35 and met up with the rest of our family. I left to get my mom's food and to make my own from the buffet area. I was waiting for the waffle to finish cooking when I noticed something back in the corner of my eye. Curiosity got the best of me and I turned around to see what the shadow was. Mickey himself was standing a couple feet away from me, entertaining a table of Swedes. It got colder, blowing down from above, which I assumed was the AC vent sending some Disney magic into the room. The waffle maker beeped. I got the almost burnt waffle onto a plate, grabbed it as well as the rest of the food and took it back to the table. By this time, my sister had rejoined us, with her full Disney World ensemble on, except the lipstick. I swear to God she looked like a Mac worker who gets paid commission, came by and threw everything they had on her. She had her head tipped back even when she was eating, and no one could figure out why. Finally, my Aunt Bonnie ventured a question. "Autumn, are you feeling okay?" Oh yeah, I'm fine. I'm just waiting for my lash glue to set." She was wearing fake eyelashes to Disney World. I should have known. This is the kind of junk I have to put up with all the time. After breakfast, we went back up to our rooms and grabbed whatever we needed for the park. It only took us a couple minutes, but to me it felt like forever. I was so excited that I waited outside our room in the hallway for my sister and mother to finish getting ready. Luckily, Nathan and Aunt Bonnie were waiting in the hallway too, so I wasn't too bored. It seemed like once my sister emerged from the room, we were in the park in a matter of seconds. We were all giddy and eager to get on a ride, so we planned which one would be the best to ride first. My uncle suggested Jungle Cruise, and we all laughed, remembering the family story of him getting scared by the skipper wielding a gun on the original ride the first year Disneyland was opened. Like I said earlier, my aunts and uncles are older. We decided that the Jungle Cruise was the best bet, so we all got in line. We looked at the scenery while we waited. We got to the front of the line and packed into the boat. I was about to get on when the worker stopped me and said that there were too many people in the boat and I'd have to wait for the next one. My mom offered to wait with me, but I declined and told her to have fun. The boat with my family shoved off and I was put in the empty single rider's line. The next boat swung around in no time and I got in. It was basically the same ride I loved at Disneyland, with a few minor changes. I gazed in amazement at all the robotic animals and live trees. I even looked down into the green water to see my reflection. I guess I looked too closely into the water because I fell in. I felt a hand on my back, but it was too late. I was already in the water. Now, you might not think this was such a big deal, but those robotic boats are on a track, and so are the animals. And I couldn't see where I was kicking, and one mistake could result in my foot hitting a gear in the best case scenario. I thought I was just treading water, but soon I found myself downstream near the alligators. I was very scared, but I was trying my best to stay calm and not to get any of the gross water into my mouth or nose. Soon enough, an empty boat came by to pull me out of the water, and I was rejoined with my worried family. My mom took me back to our room so I could take a shower while the rest of our group went on another ride. While I was bathing, a man came to our room wanting to speak with my mom. She told me that she'd be right back, and by the time that I got out and had fresh clothes on, she was. The man was from their legal team, and they worked out a compensation for my trauma. Our entire family's vacation was now all-inclusive with $200 spending money each. I guess you could say my mom made a good deal. Thankfully, my mom had my stuff when we went on the Jungle Cruise, so I just put on my backpack and off we went to meet up with the rest of our family. We found them fairly quickly with the help of some vague texts from my sister, more descriptive texts from my cousin Audrey, a park map, and a cast member. They were deciding what to ride next. My Uncle Dan was trying to convince everyone that we should ride the train. Not the train that went around the park, no. The Thunder Mountain Railroad train. No one wanted to go on the roller coaster right then, including me, so he said he'd go by himself and meet us for lunch at the pizza place in Tomorrowland. We waved goodbye to Uncle Dan as we went off to find another ride, and he went to the back of the line. We decided to go on the Indiana Jones ride before lunch. which was a bad idea because half of our family got motion sickness. Uncle Dan didn't have a cell phone, so we either had to wait for him at the meeting place, which would make people sick due to the food, or meet him at the next ride. Our group didn't want anyone throwing up, so we went to wait for him at the exit of the ride. We figured since we had only been gone about 45 minutes, Dan would either be still in line or on the ride. We waited an hour, but no sign of him. Our family was getting really worried. Some thought the line was longer than we thought. Some thought Dan went back to his room without telling us. But the rest thought he was over to the meeting place and was waiting for us there. We sent a small expedition team of my sister, my cousin Sarah, my Aunt Jean, and Uncle Bruce over to Tomorrowland to find our lost one. We waited another 15 minutes before we got the call that Dan was nowhere in sight. Frustrated and very hungry, my Aunt Linda went over to the cast member sweeping nearby to ask for help. She didn't get to finish before a shriek filled the air. This wasn't your normal, "Oh, I'm on a thrill ride and wouldn't it be fun to scream." This was, "I woke up while they were doing minor surgery on me" scream. A deafening crack split across the sky, like thunder, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Everyone looked wildly around to find the source of the sound, but it seemed everywhere. Someone pointed to the ride behind us with their mouth agape. I instinctively looked. A train was falling out of the sky, directly towards the track. We ran over to where Linda was and stared in horror as the train screeched towards the ride, appearing to be on track to crashing in the car that was already on the rails. I squinted my eyes, and just before impact, the falling train stopped. It hovered for a second before gliding into the exit platform. We all screamed when we saw Uncle Dan emerge from the crazy train. He went through the exit and rejoined us. "Hey," he said. "What's going on? Did something happen?" I was in shock. He didn't remember a thing. I texted my sister to let them know that we found Uncle Dan and that we were coming over to the food place. We prompted him on our way over, but we brushed it off like we were playing a joke on him. I had a bad feeling about something, but I kept going because I didn't want to hold anyone back or miss out. Soon enough, we got our food and everything seemed to be more or less back to normal. I was halfway through my slice of pizza when I had to use the bathroom. I was still a little shook up about the Jungle Cruise thing, as anyone would be, so I asked my mom if she would come with me. She agreed and we excused ourselves from the table. Surprisingly, there was no line for the women's bathroom, so I just went right in while my mom waited outside near the drinking fountain. You know how you can sort of see outside the stall, from in between the cracks? Well, I was looking around. I normally do this when I'm anxious, and my eyes locked on the wall vent near the sinks. Something black was coming out, but I couldn't quite make it out, like it was blurred. I blinked a couple times to clear my vision, but the blurriness stayed the same. I kept looking at this bit of weirdness until some of it spilled onto the floor. It looked like the end of one of those cheesy Grim Reaper outfits kids wear on Halloween. This struck a fear in me I've only felt one other time, but I knew somehow that I couldn't let it know I was scared or even saw it. Trying to keep my cool, I called my mom in while I watched the thing coming out of the vent. As soon as I heard her footsteps on the linoleum, the vent creature evaporated like smoke. I got of there as fast as possible, and was going to tell the others when the speakers crackled to life. "Attention! The park will be temporarily closed due to maintenance. We are sorry for any inconvenience." We packed up our food and headed for the nearest exit. I noticed while we were waiting in line to get out, a couple of guys wearing black shirts and khaki pants run from a door out into the park. I think they were park security, because on their belts they had guns. The line moved quickly after that, and soon enough we had our hands stamped. We got back to our rooms and I took a nap while we waited for the park to reopen. My mom woke me up after they made the announcement that the park was open again, and I was ready to go back in a flash. When we got back in, one of the first things I noticed was there was ropes around the entrances to the single riders lines. All in all, this was a weird trip, one that I'll never forget. I was about 6 or 7 when we took a family holiday to Disneyland. I was a fairly aloof child, and stranger danger was something that had been drilled into us at school. My mom was paranoid about going off with strangers and was convinced that I was a target, being a blue-eyed blonde kid. All I wanted was my freedom to run around. From day one, I had a Velcro strap around my wrist, with a cable linking me to my mom, who wore the other end on her wrist. I was effectively on a lead. A week at Disney on a lead was hell for me, and probably for my parents too. Nowadays, you could call it ADD. Back then, it was called naughty. If I wasn't trying to undo the strap, I was barking like a dog. I was a joy of a child. The last day there, I had calmed down. Well, I was speaking like a human again, rather than a dog. I begged and begged for my parents to let me off the lead until they finally gave in and said yes, I could take the strap off. But I had to hold one of their hands. Fair deal. All went great to begin with. I stayed close to my parents, held their hands. As time went by and it became clear that I wasn't going to run off, I was allowed moments of freedom. No hands. There were so many exciting things to see, all my favorite Disney characters waving, and my favorite music playing. We began to cross an open area, which I think was generally towards the exit of the park. I was still hands-free. My attention was firmly fixed on Minnie Mouse, who was ahead of me. My dad grabbed my hand. I stuck to the rules. The deal was that I had to hold my parents' hand, so off we went towards the exit to leave. When my dad started running, I began to run too. I wasn't sure of what we were running to, but I was a hyperactive child, so in my head was yay, running. I then heard my mom scream, my name from behind me. I looked over my shoulder to see my mom, my brother, and to my surprise, my dad chasing after me. I felt the hand holding mine tighten, and I looked at the man I thought was my dad. He was a mid-50s man with gray hair and a gray beard. Not my 40-year-old dad, with black hair and no beard. Creepy dude never once looked at me. His face was blank and he looked calm. My little feet brakes came on out of shock, and I became a lead weight, which along with the people who stopped around us due to my mom screaming was enough for my sprinting family to catch up with me. Would-be child abductor then clearly decided that he didn't fancy his chances against my dad, dropped my hand and disappeared. My dad chased him and my mom and brother grabbed me. I can't remember much of what happened afterwards. My dad was built for comfort, not speed, so he didn't catch the dude. My mom was hysterical. I was gutted because this meant I was never being let off a lead again. I think my parents saw the police out there, and they said there were a number of attempted abductions around that time at the Disney park. Disney child abductor, let's not meet again. I know this sounds totally crazy, and I probably wouldn't believe it if it didn't happen to me. I've never been a believer in the paranormal, but honestly, I have no idea what to make of what happened last night. I will say it again before you read this that it sounds insane, but please know I am telling the truth. I wasn't drunk or high, and I was with a friend of mine who saw the exact same thing. I go to college in a smallish school in Wisconsin. One thing this school is known for is having crazy parties out in the surrounding woods. I know it sounds stupid, but it's the only way to make sure that Campus PD doesn't come and shut it down. I haven't ever been to one of these parties. I've had difficulty with anxiety, but after 2 years of therapy and medication, I finally decided I wanted to go to at least one party before I graduate. I'm a senior. So anyway, I talked to my friend Gina, who's known as a bit of a party girl, and she tells me there's going to be a big party in the woods this Thursday. A lot of kids at my school don't have class on Friday, so we make plans to go. So last night, me and her head down a trail into the woods with flashlights, and we joke about how creepy it was. Everything was going smoothly at first, until we go down a smaller trail that was only 2 feet wide instead of the normal road-sized trails that we usually go through. I was kind of freaked out, but didn't say anything because I assumed she knew where we were going. So we follow this trail a bit longer, and eventually come to this sort of clearing, where the trees aren't too dense and we could see a towel and a few bottles on the ground. At this point, my friend tells me that she's got a bit turned around, but knows that we're very close to the party because she's been at the clearing before, and she starts calling out, "Hey," hoping someone would hear her and shout back. When this doesn't work, she takes out her phone and calls one of her friends that she said was going to meet her at the party. The friend answers and apparently tells her where they were. Gina then tells me she knows where they are and that we're close. I joke that she better not get me killed, and as we nervously laugh, we hear a nya, nya, nya sound coming from behind us, followed by what sounded like a cross between a whistle of an old train and somebody blowing. We then turn around thinking, what the fuck was that? We shine our flashlights on a deer standing up on its hind legs with one arm against a tree looking at us. I know it sounds stupid, but just the way that it was watching us and standing up there was the most unsettling thing I have ever seen in my life. My friend takes off running and I'm still standing there looking at it, trying to make heads or tails of it before I start running after Gina, trying not to be left alone with this thing. Luckily for me, Gina runs into a tree and I catch up with her and start yelling at her about leaving me alone, when we hear another whistling sound out to the left of us and turn our flashlights to see another deer looking at us. But this one was walking toward us on its hind legs, but not like a person, like a dog. It gets close but walks behind the tree with only its head and neck poking out, watching us. I've never been so scared in my life and start to cry and yell at Gina, telling her to call the cops. Like that would do any good. At this point, I honestly thought I was going to die. I was just so scared that we had heard another whistle sound somewhere in the woods behind us. We heard a rustling sound in the woods and we were sure that this was it. This is where we were going to die. But instead walked out a giant. I mean giant. Like newfound size, but with short hair like a lab. Black dog. The dog then walked right up to us, looked at us for a bit, and looked at the deer behind the tree, which then started to make a nya, nya sound, like we had heard earlier. But the dog just stood there looking at it. Not growling or barking or anything, just staring. The deer then started to make a huge coughing sound, but the dog stared at it without making a noise, before turning around and just ignoring it, and walking over to us and started barking and baying. A minute later, a professor who I'd taken a class with sophomore year burst through the brush and started yelling at Baron, his dog who had apparently run away into the woods. He was really confused to see us, but saw that we were crying and offered to take us back to his house and drove us back to campus. I haven't slept since that night, and I've been all over the internet trying to make sense of what I saw, and I think it was a skinwalker. When I was young, I lived in quite a small town in Queensland. The whole town was surrounded by trees in every direction for hundreds of kilometers, and we had so much room to play. This particular story is about the first time we got drunk. In the winter, the levels of water would drop significantly, enough for us to camp on the riverbed. My best mate's parents owned a pub at the time, so we were in charge of getting the drinks for our little trip, so we could finally cross that off our bucket lists. The place we had in mind was out near an old settlement, where a few creepy things have happened to us over time. So we made our way down to the riverbank, which was low on the side we came in and really high on the other side. You couldn't see the other side through all of the trees on top, and it was kind of unnerving knowing that someone could be up there watching and you wouldn't know. There are about 7 of us kids in the camp, and our parents have no idea where we are or what we're doing. We lied and said we were staying at a friend's place. We set up camp and built a little shelter for all of us to sleep under. We got all set up and started drinking as the sun was setting. Soon, it was dark, and we were in full swing of mixing drinks and singing songs and throwing stuff into the water, and generally making a whole heap of noise. As we were starting to wind down, one of my friends said he saw something move at the top of the riverbank on the steep side. We all say that he is full of shit and should calm down, but he is adamant that someone is up there. So we all start calling out, "Come out, you coward," and other such things, being brave well beyond our years. To our surprise, a man wearing straggly clothes and no shoes comes out of the tree line, stands on the edge of the bank and just stares at us. We all go silent, waiting for him to do something, but for about 5 minutes, he just stands there, and then he retreats back into the tree line. We talk amongst ourselves and get a bit nervous, but we soon forget it. About an hour later, the guy is back, but he isn't on the bank anymore. He is coming out of the shadows from the other side of the bank and entering our camp. He comes over and stands next to the fire, joins our group of 12-year-old kids and just stands there. We are all officially a bit scared and don't really know what to do, so we just sat there in silence. Eventually, one of my friends gets up the courage to speak to him. "G'day, mate. How are you? Are you okay?" The guy just stares at my friend and then starts staring at each one of us for a little bit, spending time on each of us. My friend tries again. "Hey, are you okay? What's your name?" The man snaps his head back at my friend and stares at him wide-eyed for at least 2 minutes before answering. Without blinking, he says in a raspy whisper, "That's none of your fucking business." And he hisses like a cat. This guy just jumps back screaming and staring at the fire like it had just appeared and runs off, up the steep bank in record time. It was impossible to get up this thing, so we all just stand there, speechless. We decide that it's best if we just stoke up the fire, because it's about a 19-kilometer walk in pitch black to town, and we weren't confident of that. So, stoke the fire we did. We sat up for as long as we could, keeping watch, not really talking. We all eventually dozed off, one by one. When we woke up in the morning, everything was gone. All of our alcohol, all of our bags, all of our shoes and blankets, everything. The creepy thing is that none of us awoke as someone robbed us blind, and there was not a single footprint. We were sleeping in damp sand, so there should have been footprints everywhere, but there were none. It looked like we hadn't even been there. Needless to say, we bailed and ran almost all the way back to town. Our feet were all cut up and messy by the time we got back. We never told our parents about the camping trip, and I think we never will. About 6 weeks ago, I went into the wilderness of East Oregon with my 2-year-old hunting dog, a golden retriever named Reggie, to hunt for pheasant, partridge, and quail, and fly fish for steelhead, which is in the high rock desert and carves a deep valley through the sagebrush-coated hills and black rock cliffs. Something happened in that canyon that changed everything I know, or thought I knew, about the world we live in. I'll start with a bit of backstory before I get into the events. I did the same camping trip with 2 buddies last November during my dog's first bird season, and we were all psyched to have a round 2. Unfortunately, one of the dudes bailed because of work pressure, and the other because he needed time to prep for an interview. So, I decided to go alone. I've done plenty of solo camping and hunting before, and this time I had my bird dog, so I felt even better going alone. There's obviously no cell phone service out there, so I gave my girlfriend and some buddies my route and camping locations, and set out before sunrise on a Friday with plans to return late on Sunday. It's about a 3-hour drive to the stretch of the John Day River Basin where I was heading, and I got there around 9:30. It was around 40 degrees when I got out at the BLM parking area to stretch and started to get ready to set out. My dog was really stoked. He knows when we're hunting when I put on my bird pouch and bust out the shotgun, and I was happy as a pig in the mud. Sun was shining, and it had snowed a few days earlier, so the red, tan, black, and green sagebrush-coated valley we started hiking down into was shimmering. I had my big backpacking pack loaded to the brim with gear and a sidearm. I don't always carry a sidearm, but 3 days and 2 nights alone in an area infested with packs of coyotes, who don't scare me but would love a golden retriever snack, and a high density of mountain lions, which definitely scare me despite being cool animals. I figured, why the hell not? We, my dog and I, rucked about 6 miles into a more open part of the valley where I wanted to spend the first night. It was around 50 degrees at this point and absolutely beautiful, while quite muddy with the snowmelt. I set up the tent on the little grassy plateau above the old trail and put the dog in the tent with some water to chill for a bit to get his paws warmed up. I ate lunch and dumped most of my gear and set out with just my camelback, bird pouch, gun and dog down further into the valley to start hunting. About as happy as a dude can be. It was slow hunting at first, but eventually we flushed a cubby of quail and a few hen pheasant. After about 4 hours, it was starting to get dark. We had 3 quail down and we were working our way back to the camp. This is where things got somewhat strange. Reggie was ahead of me and I was struggling through some thick brush to get back to the trail from the river when the dog bolted back through the gap he had gone through with his ears back and his eyes wide. He kind of huddled and paced anxiously behind my legs. It wasn't normal behavior for him unless he was startled by something like a door slamming or a leaf blower. I looked forward to where he came from and immediately thought cougar. I aimed my gun forward as if I was about to flush a bird and moved through the gap in the brush with Reggie reluctantly at my heels. I pushed into the opening below the trail and noticed out of the corner of my eye a body of tan fur low in the grass, and whipped to my right with a shotgun at my shoulder ready to shoot. I then saw hooves, and then a face, and to the relief of the adrenaline throbbing behind my eyes, I realized it was a female bighorn sheep lying in the grass. She was shaking violently, and her eyes were white with terror, and she was clicking her teeth through a slick of frothy drool and wheezing like a sick old horse. I couldn't see any obvious broken bones or lacerations on her, and she was quite young, maybe 2 years old, and there was nowhere she could have fallen from. I figured she was just sick and dying. I actually gave her a slight shrug as if to suggest, Mother Nature's a bitch, sorry girl, best of luck to ya, and had to drag Reggie by his collar to the left, away from the strange, frantic thing. I'd run into dying deer and elk in the Rockies where I grew up, and I knew that sometime soon, as if camp wasn't that far off, I'd hear the terrible noise of coyotes beginning to feast. For those who haven't heard it, when coyotes set upon a living meal, they yip, snarl, and screech a horrible chorus of death. I didn't look forward to hearing that old death song, if it was to come, because I knew it would scare the shit out of my dog. But hey, Mother Nature's a bitch. We got to the camp. I took some photos of the sunset, seared up a little quail with some potatoes, ate my dinner, fed the dog, had some sips of bourbon, and climbed into the tent. The last thing I remember is being anxious the coyotes would find the dying bighorn and wake us up. I woke up freezing cold, feet and hands numb, and had an immediate adrenaline surge. I fumbled around for my headlamp, and when I turned it on, I saw that my tent flap was halfway unzipped and my dog was gone. I kind of freaked the hell out, to be honest, and started screaming, Reggie, come! Reggie, come! Reggie! And as I slammed my numb feet into my boots and rushed outside, there was a low howl of wind and there was a bit of moonlight, so I could see the glimmering river on the other side of the valley. I had my revolver in one hand and the hunting whistle in the other, and stomped the campground screaming for the dog, and shining the light everywhere I could. Cougars are awake whenever they want, and coyotes are nocturnal, and I was looking for blood, or tracks, or anything. For those who haven't experienced it, when you lose your dog, there's some pretty extreme panic. Mine being coupled with waking up in the middle of the dark wilderness. I think it was because of the panic that I didn't realize that my tent flap had been unzipped, until about 60 seconds of yelling at him. I looked back at it with the headlamp and lit it up as it flagged in the breeze, and kind of pushed it out of my mind, figuring that Reggie could have pushed it or rolled into the tent flap and forced the zipper down. Then I saw eyes peer over a boulder a bit down the slope. I started pacing toward the eyes and pointed my revolver at the boulder below the eyes and said sternly, "Reggie, come. Reggie!" And the eyes looked away. I bolted down the slope and noticed something move on the top of the boulder. I moved around the rock and saw it was Reggie. He was sitting up there like I commanded him to sit, with a treat in my hand, staring over the valley toward the river. He was shaking like he'd just come out of an ice bath, and with the light, I could see his breath, like cigarette smoke in the cold air. I said something like, "Reggie, what? Reggie, come. Heal, heal." But he wouldn't move, wouldn't even look away from the dark valley. Then I climbed on top of the boulder and put my arms around him, and it was almost like something released him. He immediately tweaked out and started snarling and crying and writhing to break free, but then noticed it was me and his tail started beating back and forth. His snarls were replaced with whimpers, and he literally tried to jump into my arms. I picked him up and jumped off the big rock and started trying to soothe him a bit. I was right outside the tent when I heard the noise I'll never forget. It's hard to describe with writing, but it sounded a bit animal and a bit like a guy trying to sing a long note of "don't, don't, don't," that increased with urgency and a hint of pleading. I threw Reggie into the tent and whipped around with a pistol, pointed it down the valley to where the noise had come. Right then, it was as if the valley itself exhaled. There was a giant windy ugh that engulfed the dark ridge. Honestly, for the first time in my life, I felt I might lose control of my bowels and crap my pants right here standing on the hillside. I could see all of the grass and sagebrush by the trees and the river start quivering in the gust. Reggie was barking like crazy, and I had just backed up into the tent and zipped it up mostly closed, leaving a bit to see out of. I tried to calm Reggie down while loading my shotgun. The seemingly demonic exhale of wind subsided, and Reggie curled up in my lap and whimpered while I just sat there with my revolver at my side, and my shotgun pointed at the tent flap. Only then did I see it was about 3:50 a.m., and start thinking through what happened and what to do. I knew booking it the 6 miles up the valley in the dark to my truck was a huge nope. I had seen microbursts of wind before, and knew the canyons and valleys were a prime spot for them, and reasoned that had been the case. Then I tried to think through the bird and the mammal species in that region that could have made that sound. There are wolves in Oregon, but not often in this area, and the "don't" sound was too deep for a coyote. I was thinking it could have been something like a swan or a big bird near the water. And what the hell was my dog doing all seized up and transfixed on the darkness on top of that rock? He had just gotten out and been confused and started becoming hypothermic or something. I really had no idea, and I couldn't figure out why I was so scared and on edge. I worked as a hunting and fishing and trekking guide in New Zealand and Patagonia after college, and grew up spending time in the wilderness in Colorado. I'd had run-ins with most of North American predator species. I'd stabilized people with head wounds miles from any road or trail. I'd dug someone out of an avalanche, and I can't remember of ever being that horrified and on edge before. I'm no Navy SEAL here, but I know how to keep my wits about me when things get tense in the back country, so I was pretty shaken up. After a couple hours, I could see the light in the sky, and then a semblance of daylight spilled into the valley. I still hadn't properly warmed up, but I threw all my layers and extra socks on, and zipped Reggie into the tent properly, and went out to poke around for a bit. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and no strange tracks to be found, other than bighorn and deer. My nerves settled a bit. Eventually, I made some coffee, ate a power bar, fed the dog, and kind of just sat there looking at Reggie. There were natural, reasonable explanations for most of last night's events. However, the one I couldn't get over was my dog. I got chills thinking about the freakish way he was frozen on top of that rock, staring into the darkness, and the way he came out of the trance once I touched him. I also couldn't get over how freaked out I was by it all once that microburst, demon sigh wind gust kicked up. I pet Reggie for a while and just watched him, almost willing him to communicate to me what he saw after he left the tent before I woke up. The wind picked up into a steady, cold sailing breeze, which did well in dissuading my plan to fly fish for the morning. I decided to break up camp and get packed up, either to keep going or to head back to the truck. I hadn't decided yet, but didn't want to wig out and bail on the weekend without actually having a good reason, other than weird stuff happening. I wasn't in any intelligible danger, which is metric number 1 in any outdoorsman's time to bail determination process. So I just didn't know what to do. After packing, I was sitting there with another cup of coffee when I heard something scuttling in the rocks up the valley above my right shoulder. Reggie heard it too, and bolted to the rise behind the tent and stared up the slope like he was pointing at a bird, hackles raised and everything. I walked over and stood behind him, expecting to see a deer or a bighorn, but only saw a little rock slide out of the scree slope about 100 yards off. Again, I thought cougar, as one could have definitely been spooked by us up into the steep boulder and cliff formations at the top of the ridge. Little rock slides happen without disturbance, but something didn't seem natural. Then the dog just bolted. He whipped around and sprinted down the slope away from me and the little rock slide above us, faster than I may have ever seen him run. I screamed after him and wailed on my hunting whistle to try to get him to hold, but he went all the way up the trail before looking back at me. Maybe this was me finally coming to my senses, but I figured, screw it, we're out of here. I heaved my pack on and made my way to Reggie, who was whining and pacing now, while looking over my shoulder. Once there, he started straight up the trail toward the car, looking at me, almost begging me with his ears down, with a "dude, let's go" face I hadn't seen before. It really put the hair on my neck up, so I just fell in behind him, and we started the hike. It was slow going because it was uphill out of the valley, and I wasn't moving as fast while keeping my eyes to the ridgeline to my right and to the sagebrush meadow to my left toward the river. I had my gun loaded because I hadn't entirely abandoned the idea of hunting on my way out, even though Reggie wasn't nose down and looking at anything but the ridge and me. Again, like he was begging me to hurry up. Also, I was sketched out in general, and a loaded shotgun is a decent remedy for fear. After about an hour and a half, I knew we were probably no more than a mile from the car, because I remember the canyon wall on the right becoming almost a sheer cliff, with occasional slot canyons leading up from the trail. When we were right at the mouth of one of these little mini canyons leading to the cliffs, Reggie stopped. He froze again, like he saw a game bird looking up in the rocks. I thought maybe it was actually a quail, so I got my gun ready and took a few paces up the ridge to see if Reggie would hunt up like he normally would. But he started whining and pacing again, and even shaking a bit while whipping his head back and forth, scanning frantically up and down the hill. I was worried then. I knew he wasn't right. I looked behind me and saw something move between two large boulders. I aimed my gun, thinking again cougar, but I saw two hooves, thinking now bighorn or mule deer. I took a few steps up the steep slope toward the animal, seeing if I could spook it up the ridge and see what it was. And the wind started picking up, and there was sage twigs whipping around the little black rocked canyon. And right then, Reggie started going insane. He was snarling and yelling like I'd never heard before. But I started saying, "Reg, stop! Reggie, no!" while slowly wheeling the corner to see what the rest of the animal was. And that's when my entire life and understanding of the world changed. Behind that rock corner was definitely a bighorn sheep. It was standing on its back legs looking at the rock wall, with its front legs curled up grotesquely into its chest where I couldn't see them. It was shifting its weight back and forth between its back hooves, and it had massive curled ram horns I'd only seen on a few big males before. I was immediately jarred by the sight, and I think I blurted out something like, "Holy hell," but thought for some reason it was just stuck or wedged there, or had fallen in the vertical position from above. Then it slowly started stepping and turning around, staying entirely on its back feet. Then it whipped around to face me, and it definitely wasn't stuck. It was literally standing comfortably, like a man, on its back legs. It looked like a normal bighorn sheep, but its eyes were wide and terrifyingly human, and staring at my stomach or waistline. It was drooling a ridiculous amount of frothy slobber out of its clattering mouth. I was tripping and sliding backwards, and a half second from blasting this freakish ram in its face when it looked right up into my eyes and shouted, with a wheezing, boyish voice with a terrified, pleading urgency, "Please don't! Please don't! Don't! Don't!" I tripped and rolled down the trail, and Reggie was tearing up the path ahead of me. I leaped up and trained my gun right up at its spot. I saw the ram's horns sticking out and most of its face, as if it was peeking out behind the rocks like a child playing hide-and-seek, and it was still staring at me, dead in the eye, then ripped its head back behind the rocks. I could hear it still, but it sounded like it was sobbing like a little boy, while repeating, "Please don't, please don't, please don't." As I was pacing backwards, I noticed that I was screaming at it like a savage, like I had done when running into black bears to try to scare them off, not saying anything intelligible, and also screaming for my dog so he didn't bolt a mile ahead. When I got 50 yards down the trail, I shot both my 12-gauge hunting loads down the empty trail into the dirt and kept walking backwards. Reggie was back at my heels at this point, but still whining and barking. I swear, I walked the whole mile backwards, scanning like a madman, hands white and stone gripped on my gun, until I got a glimpse of the valley opening where my truck was. Then I just bolted. I sprinted like a child running from a monster. Reggie stayed ahead of me, and when we were at the truck, I tore my keys out of my bag, threw the dog, bag, and gun into the car, and tore out of the valley back to the state highway like a drag racer. I stopped at the first town and tried to calm Reggie down, and myself, and I still didn't get cell service. I went to the gas station, not to get anything really, but just to interact with another human and make sure the ram monster, or my insanity, was isolated in the canyon. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because the first thing the woman said was, "You okay, hun?" I bought a Gatorade and drove back north to the interstate and straight home. I haven't slept right since. My diet is all messed up. I can't think at work. My dog is super jumpy and doesn't like walking at night anymore. Not sure what to do to get over my encounter with this talking, pleading, sobbing beast. But I know one thing for sure. I am not hunting or camping alone anymore. And I am never going to set foot in the John Day River basin as long as I live. Not a chance in hell. Rewind 2 weeks. It's the 4th of July.
A few of my friends want to actually do something instead of lounge around in front of our computers like we do every day. There were 5 of us: me, Neil, Elijah, JD, and Neil's sister, Katie. Neil had the idea to go to his grandparents' house, as they owned a farmhouse. We live in Texas, so having that much space, especially with other houses being half a mile out, it was the perfect place to pop fireworks without getting into too much trouble. The drive from where we lived to their house was about a 40-mile drive. Unfortunately, the only car that we had at our hands was a 2-door, so trying to fit 5 of us into the car was hectic, to say the least. The drive was actually tolerable. 3 of my friends were in the back and found a comfortable, yet funny position to sit in the car. The music Katie was playing was helping a lot and definitely passed the time. We all bought some fireworks halfway there, and my friends jumped back into their designated position for another 20 miles. As we got there, Neil forgot to mention that his grandparents were out of town for the week, which made the experience ahead of us a lot better. All of us got out of the car except for Katie, who suggested that she get us all food and sodas for the night. She kept the fireworks in the back because she didn't want us popping any off while she was gone. She drove off and we were all left there without fireworks. So we did the next best thing, went to the pool in the back. Something that already put me off was that ranch sat considerably close to a forest. Neil even went the extra step to tell me that there's an occasional wolf that can be a hassle to deal with. Of course, I got nervous because I had nothing to defend myself with if one had jumped over the fence. He handed me a pocket knife, saying that there's a shotgun in the living room if something goes down. He mentioned that he was going to set up a game of Risk for us all to play while Katie was out, as the drive to the closest market was well over a couple miles out. So, Elijah and I sat poolside, telling stories to each other about stupid stuff that happened while we were in college. During our talk, I was staring out in the forest line, paranoid about the wolves that Neil teased me about. I saw something move. I couldn't tell since the porch light behind me was making it harder to see any details, but the way it moved made my heart jump. Elijah could see my body language as he leaned in to see what was there. He started to ask me what I saw, and I replied with a wolf on the tree line. He looked toward where I pointed, and he calmed down. "That's just Katie, dude. I think she was trying to scare us." He started calling her name, waving his arm and laughing, saying how she scared the hell out of me. Neil came out of the house, wondering what Elijah was screaming about. Then he saw his sister standing in the field. He started to laugh when Elijah told him what happened and how I was on the edge of my seat. JD came out of the house next, and Neil told him to help Katie with the bags and grab the fireworks. Katie, who was out in the field, started to wave back, but the wave definitely seemed out of place. It wasn't so much waving, but a sudden jerk, like if you were trying to pop your elbow. Elijah yelled for Katie to come back so we can start the party, but JD came back with a terrified look on his face. "Katie's not back yet. I just called her. She's still on the road towards Walmart." Their laughing stopped, and Elijah's face faded, and his arm fell into his lap with a thud. Everyone looked at the still jerking figure in the field. Then, she screamed. The scream was so loud, it sounded like it may as well have been a couple feet away. All of us scrambled, running back into the house. Slamming the door behind us, Neil shouted for us to lock the doors and grab the shotgun in the living room. I ran to grab the shotgun, as it was the closest thing to us, while the other 2 ran to each of the doors leading inside. Quickly, I grabbed the shotgun and stuffed a couple of shells in my pocket, running back to the kitchen, where we came in from, and handed the shotgun to Neil. I pulled out the shells and sat them on the counter, and he loaded one in. JD came back nearly covered in sweat, freaking out, and shouted, "What the fuck was that?" Just as scared as he was, I look at both of them. Elijah quickly joining us again. "You don't think it was a skinwalker? I read stories. I've been all over 4chan and creepypastas." JD tried to reassure us. "No, it can't be. That's Katie. I'm sure she's just trying to scare us." "Cut the bullshit, JD," Neil barked at him. "That scream wasn't human. You already called her, and you told us she was still going out." He turned back to the door, pushing the blinds slightly, to find Katie closer to us. It stood at the gates of the pool, illuminated by the light, and revealing that didn't look much like Katie at all. The hair was a mess, and the clothes looked tattered. Her skin was bruised. The one thing that caught our eye most was her face. The head was tilted, like it struggled to support the weight. The eyes were blank with emotion, and the jaw was agape. It raised an arm, jerking it like it did before in a mock wave. The jerking, however, started to get more violent as the entire body started to shake uncontrollably. Neil quickly closed the curtains and backed off. He orders us to sit behind the counter. He set himself in the gap leading into the kitchen with a gun aimed at the door. I was silent for what felt like an hour. The three of us continued to look at Neil, who was completely focused on the door. A massive, grotesque smell entered our noses, and all of us reacted appropriately. The horrid stench was like if you left groceries to ferment in a box in the summer heat, with a couple of carcasses as a garnish. It was definitely hard to breathe, tasting the smell in the back of your throat, even with your nose pinched. It was so bad, JD actually threw up. Then, without any warning, the smell was gone. The hot air that was the smell went away, and was easier to breathe. I was afraid to let go of my nose, but was rewarded with a breath of fresh air. Everyone took a couple of breaths to rid their lungs of the pungent smell that lingered before. Neil asked us if we were okay and replied, JD being the exception since he'd puked. We heard what sounded like a whine. It sounded like a mix between a dog and a child about to cry. It was coming from the porch door, but from the front where we came in from the car. All of us stood up, Neil moving forward as we stayed back. We knelt down by the stairs, still hearing this whining. It didn't hit me until we positioned ourselves, but it sounded like something was trying to talk for the first time, like an animal. In a raspy, but still high-pitched voice, I could make out a very small portion of what it was trying to say. Ye, fuck, hot. It kept repeating this, until it started to sound more enunciated, more human. What the fuck was that? It sounded like JD. Same accent, same speech pattern, same voice. JD started to shiver. His breath was getting shallow. He shouted back in a scared voice I'd never heard come from his mouth until now. Get out. Leave us alone. Get the fuck out. Leave us alone. Get out. The last words that we heard were in the same scream we heard when we saw it initially. It started to pound on the door. Not like it was trying to force itself in, but like an impatient knock. It started to scream in the same pitch we heard it when we initially saw it. Get out! Get out! Get out! It terrified all of us. The inhuman screams, the polite pounding on the door. I started crying. I thought this was it. Neil wasn't scared, like us. He was right pissed. He stood up storming towards the door, screaming. He swung open the door, pointing his shotgun at whatever was on the other side, pulling the trigger, filling all of our ears with the sound of a shotgun blast, and the ringing to follow. Neil stood at the door, huffing. His body language was wanting to rip this thing apart. I stood up, looking past his arm, seeing nothing but a shell on the ground. I looked up past his shoulders, seeing nothing on the driveway and the road leading back to where we came. He turned around, the adrenaline fading away, and a shaky voice coming from his mouth. "We're not staying here. JD, call Katie and tell her to get ready to go back home when she comes back." The rest of the time, all of us were in the kitchen. The shotgun sat on the counter with several shells near the butt of the gun. None of us wanted to say anything. None of us wanted to look at each other. It was nothing but silence until Katie called us. Neo quickly wrote a note, leaving it on the gun as we left. All of us hopped into the car, silent. Katie noticed our behavior and constantly edged us to tell her what happened. She pouted and put on her music to cheer us up. The only thing I could hear was the blood-curdling scream, telling us to get out. My background. My dad is full-blooded Navajo from northern Arizona, and my mom is white. I grew up in SoCal, but grew up going to the res every year and eventually moved and worked there. I'm not a skinwalker expert by any means, but I'll share what I know. The first experience I had was on one of my first solo trips without my parents, out to our ranch on the reservation. I went with my cousin and a few friends. Our ranch is pretty much in the middle of nowhere, the nearest people being at the very closest 10 miles away, so you're pretty much on your own. Our first night out there, we arrived around 2 a.m., and there was no moon, and it was pitch black. So we had a hard time finding our hogan, a traditional octagon-shaped Navajo house. We decided to just camp near a cattle corral, which we found. We set up tents and knocked out until the sun came up. When I woke up, I took a little walk around our campsite and found coyote tracks which encircled our camp and actually got pretty close to the tents and campfire, which was pretty weird and a bad sign for several reasons. The rest of the day went without incident. We woke up, cooked breakfast, explored the rim of the Grand Canyon on the reservation side, and checked out old hogans in the area. We stayed up partially late that night. We had been out exploring at night and four-wheeling off some road trails. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. We were driving up a rocky road that went up to a small canyon, so there was hills pretty high and steep on both sides of me. I was standing in the back of the truck with a spotlight. That was when I saw the first light. The best way to describe what I saw was the visual effect of when you're standing in a room and someone behind you takes a picture with a flash. There was a brief instant in which everything lit up behind me, but it was a dull orange reddish light. I turned around towards where it came from and shined the light around, but there was nothing there whatsoever. Just a bunch of rocks. We thought it was weird, but kept driving. Once on top of the hill, we stopped to look around and noticed the weird light again. But this time it was far away, at least several miles. It was the same color, but looked like a muzzle flash from a gun. I waited and waited to hear the gunshot, thinking it was people like us shooting at night. But it never came. Then we saw another flash, but this time it was several miles west, and a bit closer. Then another closer and closer, within a few minutes. We decided it was a little weird without talking about it, turned around and went to the hogan this time. We didn't really talk about the lights for some reason, and we all settled down in the hogan. There was myself, my cousin, and my 2 white friends. We talked for a while, and it was at that moment when everyone stops talking and everyone is just about to fall asleep when this happened. The door There's only one door, a small wooden door which locks shut, shook violently as someone kicked the door as hard as they could. It was loud and strong enough to where you could hear the lock rattle and the door bounce back and rattle against the wooden frame. My friends shot up and said, "What the hell was that?" They had good reason to be alarmed. We were very far from anyone else, and they knew that. It's extremely quiet out here, pretty much deafening silence, and you can hear when vehicles are approaching. I got out of bed, grabbed a shotgun, and told my cousin to get his rifle. I walked to the door, motioned for him to come over, and said, "You get left, I'll go right." I'm not really sure why, but I wasn't scared despite the obvious weirdness of what was going on. I ripped the door open, and we both slipped out the door after one another and swept the area. Looked everywhere we could, and went to the truck and got the spotlight and swept the area. Nothing. No footprints, no animals, nothing. We decided to send a message and shot some rounds off to scare whatever it was anyway. I think we were all kind of worried, but eventually went back to the Hogan and settled back in, kind of joking about it to calm our nerves. Eventually, we all fell asleep, but I hid my nervousness, and my heart was still racing. It wasn't until everyone was quiet and asleep that I noticed a thumping. I heard it very faintly through the rock walls, and when I put my ear up to the wall, I heard it a lot better. It was a very rhythmic thumping sound, something very heavy, and timed the same every single thump. It sounded as if it was coming through the rock table that the Hogan sits on top of. I tried to rationalize it and told myself it was just the cows, and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up the next morning and we went to check the cows, which were about 10 miles away on the ranch and hadn't been anywhere near our Hogan last night. Several days later, I told my aunts about what happened. They told me that one of my Navajo grandparents who lived alone and out in the middle of nowhere had weird things happen too. The same night we had our door kicked, someone had knocked on her door in the middle of the night. When she opened the door, there was no one there. My aunts think it was a skinwalker who was messing with me and my cousins because we're mixed. I had a lot of weird stuff happen when I was working there as an EMT as well. It was around 2008, in northern Arizona on a Navajo reservation just on the border of the Hopi Reservation, which oddly enough is inside the Navajo Reservation. I was working as an EMT for the tribe and had just gotten my medical license a few weeks ago, and it was on one of my first shift where I wasn't third hand on the ambulance with 2 other EMTs. I was working night shift on a spring night. It was a little chilly, but not cold enough to need a jacket. The moon wasn't really out, so it was another dark night on the res. We were stationed outside the emergency department, working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and responding to 911 calls. We got paged out for a man-down call to the Hopi village with no other information. We usually asked assistance from the police department in securing the scene just because that's standard protocol, and a lot of times it's a nightmare call. There's a possibility of domestic violence or rowdy people, but as there's very few police present on the reservation, there were no police units available to respond with us. We were on our own. We responded code 2, lights but no sirens, and made our way to the village, which was only 10 minutes away. We arrived on scene and immediately saw the patient lying on the ground in the dirt in front of the house. It actually turned out to be a distant relative of mine somehow. I had never met or known him, but I think he was my cousin's distant uncle. He was breathing, but drunk and unconscious. He looked as though someone had either kicked him or stomped on his chest. Nothing required us to load and go, but we would transport him to the hospital to sober up and just to be safe. We checked in his house, found some drunks. Might have been the people who assaulted him, and kicked them out. Now it was partially dark, and in the Hopi village, in that section, There were no streetlights. The only lights we had were the big lights on the side of our ambulance, which cast a big circle of light around the unit. There weren't any porch lights either, so it was pretty dark aside from the ambulance area. What I first noticed was quite weird. A few residents came out of their houses, which was odd because it was 2 a.m. But this village is small, so I didn't think much of it. It was pretty eerie though, because they all stayed just on the outside of the line which the light made. I could tell that they were just neighbors, but they seemed reluctant to walk into the light. At first we arrived, there were lots of dogs barking, and all of the normal noises, birds, cars, bugs, etc. We were outside by the patient, just about to get him onto the stretcher when everything changed. Out of nowhere, there was an incredibly loud howling, which pretty much sounded like a werewolf in a movie. It lasted for a good 15 seconds, long enough to make us freeze and look at each other. It sounded almost exactly like a wolf, but was odd because it sounded like a person doing a wolf call. But it was way too loud to be done by a person unless they were standing right next to us. You could actually feel the reverberate through your body. I had lived there for about a year at this point, so I wasn't super new, but knew enough to where I looked at my partner with a "is this normal?" look. Somehow he knew I was asking without verbalizing it, and shrugged while looking around nervously. I looked back around and all the people were gone in an instant. There was no one around whatsoever. You wouldn't have known that they were even there. Even the people we kicked out of the house were nowhere to be seen, and all of the normal noises were gone. All of the dogs immediately stopped barking, which usually doesn't happen. If anything, the opposite usually happens when there's a noise. Dogs go crazy. We took the sign of everyone getting out of there as a cue to get out. My partner said, "Let's get the hell out of here," and we loaded the patient and were driving out of the village, probably the fastest I've ever seen a non-crucial patient get transported. It wasn't until years later I moved away. I saw the Navajo Cops episode of The Howler, but I found it pretty interesting, considering the area that the episode was pretty far from where we were. Edit. I don't know if that was a skinwalker, or really what it was. Take it as you will. My father told me a story once. I'll never forget it, for a few reasons. I think it's the first story he ever told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died, but honestly, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts, aliens, and you think to yourself, that isn't real. They're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're crazy, or something like that. You just can't believe it until something happens. Something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you. Maybe you hear it. Maybe you hear the same story again and again, happening to different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet I started to believe. I started to hear other stories, just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know of what the consensus has taken to naming it. When he chose to call it something other than it or that thing, he called it Skinwalker, after an old Cherokee tale his grandfather told him. But I'll tell you the story the way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night, he'd tell me. Coyotes. We'd kill them for $50 a skin. They lived in a dairy farm in Ohio. They'd kill calves sometimes. We'd do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we'd come across a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and began heading home, walking, because we didn't have a car or some four-wheeler back then. We'd cut through the woods. That's when we came upon it. Blood everywhere, splattered on the trees, in the grass, in the creek, everywhere. At first, we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We'd seen it sometimes. They can't scavenge and start hunting a deer or cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs. But this wasn't like that. See, when a pack of dogs or wolves or coyotes attack something, they do it right. They pick off the one that's weak or sick or old or just small. They hunt it, draw it into a corner, someplace it can't get out of, and they'll run it right into the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see the alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its throat's gone, and then it'll drop dead. It's quick and clean. That wasn't what happened here. Something had ran up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, wolves neither, because they'd get too much of a fight. There were three bodies, just torn apart. You'd see a head there, a leg there, a torso here. Predators don't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. What had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of carcasses, and we think it's something we gotta take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs, but I wasn't leaving him, and I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. He was 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was the only gun he could reliably use. Dad had a shotgun, and I wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard either. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. I know I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing noises. I've been in a lot of woods in my life. I've been all over the world, and I haven't ever heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Heard deer, a fox, and rabbits, and a raccoon, and birds. Just scared. Keep in mind, this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock. Except the fox and some birds, nothing was supposed to be even awake. But they aren't just awake, they were moving. I saw flocks of birds, just trying to get out of there. We came upon a pack of coyotes, nearly shot a couple of them, thinking it was what we were looking for. But then we saw they were running towards us, then right past us. Didn't even notice. Then some deer did the same. Then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, and even a couple wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of there. We should have put it together that maybe whatever we were tracking, it wasn't something we were supposed to see, and wasn't something we could kill. I don't know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go toward trouble, to fight. And knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. We finally get into an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks. A lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land. But where that deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step, like they were leaving it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. But that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing 40 pounds nearly tore out my damn throat once. All that means is it's quick and hard to hit. So we follow the tracks, and it doesn't take us long to find where it is. There's this old schoolhouse that sits on the top of the hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, but nobody lived there, not for a long time. We caught homeless people in there sometimes, or even druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was some sick kid riding a high, but we didn't think that for long. We'd get within 50 yards, and we'd hear this noise, a scratching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds. One was a high-pitched screech, another was a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time. We get within 20 yards, and we hear the sound. I can remember thinking it sounded like paper being torn apart, while someone was swishing water in a bucket back and forth. My dad looks at me, kneels down and whispers, "I gotta stay behind him, because we're about to corner him. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially if it's a predator. But we can tell by the tracks that it's just one. He tells me it's probably a single feral dog, most likely rabid. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it till it didn't move anymore, then slit its throat. And if it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it or stab it to get it off of him." So he walks up, and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side, so I can see what it is. I wish to this day that I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tearing off its flesh, and throws what it doesn't nibble aside. There was blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale white, human-looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a human, but it sat like a monkey, hunched over, and its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we see that, and my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, so he clears his throat, trying to get it to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I haven't ever heard true silence before that, and not after it. But for 2 seconds, nothing. Nothing made any noise, which made it all the louder when it turned around and made this shrill cry and jumped on my dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind. But it was on him, tears parts of him off. I start shooting with my .22 point blank, but it barely bled. I got off 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the butt of the gun. It wasn't budging. It didn't even register that I was there. It's clawing at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh, and starts on his torso, ripping off skin, and then moves up. It tore off his throat, and then his nose, ripped off the bottom half of his jaw. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ends up in the thing's shoulder, and my dad ends up on my back. I'm running, and by God I'm running faster than I have ever ran before, and it's following me. I end up back in the woods, opposite the ones we've been in. I'm heading towards my landlord's house, 'cause it's half a mile away. I can hear the thing screeching and moaning. I hear these tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone's taking an axe to every single tree I pass. It's cracking so loud and often, but I just can't look back. Finally, I trip into gravel. I look up, and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I scream and I cry, and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance. And he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What's on your back?" he asked me. Just as he said it, he saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. It was what was left of my dad. Suddenly we hear it, screeching. He grabs me and my dad gets thrown to the ground. I'm fighting him, crying, 'cause I think we can still save him somehow. But my dad had been gone before I ever picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me aside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all inside and locking their doors and getting guns. The landlord's asking me what happened, but I just don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it all together to understand that there was something dangerous there. All the lights in the house were on, and someone called the cops. They'll be there, but in 15 minutes. We look outside, and I see it walk in front of the fire they'd made. They don't know what it is. One of them says it looks like an ape. Suddenly, something goes through the window. We shoot at it, but it ain't the thing. It's my landlord's dog. Just the body, though, not its head or legs. We start pushing things in front of the doors and windows when we hear something in the garage. I remember one of my friends saying the doors were open. We hear metal and glass just get ripped apart, but we put a couch and TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent, like it was before. We could hear it move around some, and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me a pistol. No sooner did I cock the hammer back did we hear something shatter upstairs. Then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out because it was inside. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as that thing did. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. It got its hand through, though. Someone with a shotgun took care of that. Put the barrel right up to its wrist and pulled the trigger. Cut its hand clean off. That only pissed it off, though. It started pushing on the door, clawing. We were on one side pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other side doing the same. The wood was just not going to hold. Someone tells us to keep our heads down. Then suddenly, the top half of the door is just gone. My ears ringing, and there were splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them unloaded on the top of the door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was still glued to the door, or what was left of it. The sun was up before they got me off it. They put me in the hospital for a while. A lot of the people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long time. When I got back home, I got a job for the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about the thing, but I signed up for the army when I was 19, and he'd sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him right away what the police told him. The story they went with was a wild animal, probably a wolf or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I asked him how could they say that when they had the hand. He looks at me stunned. He tells me the hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car wrecked into a tree and died on impact. The hand was never found, probably taken away by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand existed at all, said it simply was the paw of a bear and it looked like a human hand. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing when I was in basic. Never found him. They say he owed some people money and just ran away, but I don't think it's that simple. I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't even if I had the whole US Army on my back. I don't think my father felt he had anything left, and that he might as well settle old scores. He went into those woods. He never came back. The FBI was called. They did a show for everyone involved, but I knew they weren't really looking. I had to get one drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they got a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing. But that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of the team, he wrote "The Rake" onto a napkin. I didn't know what it meant until I searched for it on the internet. Honestly, I would have rather not known. Rewind 2 weeks. It's the 4th of July. A few of my friends want to actually do something instead of lounge around in front of our computers like we do every day. There were 5 of us: me, Neil, Elijah, JD, and Neil's sister, Katie. Neil had the idea to go to his grandparents' house, as they owned a farmhouse. We live in Texas, so having that much space, especially with other houses being half a mile out, it was the perfect place to pop fireworks without getting into too much trouble. The drive from where we lived to their house was about a 40-mile drive. Unfortunately, the only car that we had at our hands was a two-door, so trying to fit 5 of us into the car was hectic, to say the least. The drive was actually tolerable. 3 of my friends were in the back and found a comfortable, yet funny position to sit in the car. The music Katie was playing was helping a lot and definitely passed the time. We all bought some fireworks halfway there, and my friends jumped back into their designated position for another 20 miles. As we got there, Neil forgot to mention that his grandparents were out of town for the week, which made the experience ahead of us a lot better. All of us got out of the car except for Katie, who suggested that she get us all food and sodas for the night. She kept the fireworks in the back because she didn't want us popping any off while she was gone. She drove off and we were all left there without fireworks. So we did the next best thing, went to the pool in the back. Something that already put me off was that ranch sat considerably close to a forest. Neil even went the extra step to tell me that there's an occasional wolf that can be a hassle to deal with. Of course, I got nervous because I had nothing to defend myself with if one had jumped over the fence. He handed me a pocket knife, saying that there's a shotgun in the living room if something goes down. He mentioned that he was going to set up a game of Risk for us all to play while Katie was out, as the drive to the closest market was well over a couple miles out. So, Elijah and I sat poolside, telling stories to each other about stupid stuff that happened while we were in college. During our talk, I was staring out in the forest line, paranoid about the wolves that Neil teased me about. I saw something move. I couldn't tell since the porch light behind me was making it harder to see any details, but the way it moved made my heart jump. Elijah could see my body language as he leaned in to see what was there. He started to ask me what I saw, and I replied with a wolf on the tree line. He looked toward where I pointed, and he calmed down. "That's just Katie, dude. I think she was trying to scare us." He started calling her name, waving his arm and laughing, saying how she scared the hell out of me. Neil came out of the house, wondering what Elijah was screaming about. Then he saw his sister standing in the field. He started to laugh when Elijah told him what happened and how I was on the edge of my seat. JD came out of the house next, and Neil told him to help Katie with the bags and grabbed the fireworks. Katie, who was out in the field, started to wave back, but the wave definitely seemed out of place. It wasn't so much waving, but a sudden jerk, like if you were trying to pop your elbow. Elijah yelled for Katie to come back so we can start the party, but JD came back with a terrified look on his face. "Katie's not back yet. I just called her. She's still on the road towards Walmart." Their laughing stopped, and Elijah's face faded, and his arm fell into his lap with a thud. Everyone looked at the still jerking figure in the field. Then, she screamed. The scream was so loud, it sounded like it may as well have been a couple feet away. All of us scrambled, running back into the house. Slamming the door behind us, Neil shouted for us to lock the doors and grab the shotgun in the living room. I ran to grab the shotgun, as it was the closest thing to us, while the other 2 ran to each of the doors leading inside. Quickly, I grabbed the shotgun and stuffed a couple of shells in my pocket, running back to the kitchen, where we came in from, and handed the shotgun to Neil. I pulled out the shells and sat them on the counter, and he loaded one in. JD came back nearly covered in sweat, freaking out and shouted, "What the fuck was that?" Just as scared as he was, I look at both of them. Elijah quickly joining us again. You don't think it was a skinwalker? I read stories. I've been all over 4chan and creepypastas. JD tried to reassure us. No, it can't be. That's Katie. I'm sure she's just trying to scare us. Cut the bullshit, JD, Neil barked at him. That scream wasn't human. You already called her, and you told us she was still going out. He turned back to the door, pushing the blinds slightly, to find Katie closer to us. It stood at the gates of the pool, illuminated by the light, and revealing that didn't look much like Katie at all. The hair was a mess, and the clothes looked tattered. Her skin was bruised. The one thing that caught our eye most was her face. The head was tilted, like it struggled to support the weight. The eyes were blank with emotion, and the jaw was agape. It raised an arm, jerking it like it did before in a mock wave. The jerking, however, started to get more violent as the entire body started to shake uncontrollably. Neil quickly closed the curtains and backed off. He orders us to sit behind the counter. He set himself in the gap leading into the kitchen with a gun aimed at the door. I was silent for what felt like an hour. The three of us continued to look at Neil, who was completely focused on the door. A massive, grotesque smell entered our noses, and all of us reacted appropriately. The horrid stench was like if you left groceries to ferment in a box in the summer heat, with a couple of carcasses as a garnish. It was definitely hard to breathe, tasting the smell in the back of your throat, even with your nose pinched. It was so bad, JD actually threw up. Then, without any warning, the smell was gone. The hot air that was the smell went away, and was easier to breathe. I was afraid to let go of my nose, but was rewarded with a breath of fresh air. Everyone took a couple of breaths to rid their lungs of the pungent smell that lingered before. Neil asked us if we were okay and replied, JD being the exception since he'd puked. We heard what sounded like a whine. It sounded like a mix between a dog and a child about to cry. It was coming from the porch door, but from the front where we came in from the car. All of us stood up, Neil moving forward as we stayed back. We knelt down by the stairs, still hearing this whining. It didn't hit me until we positioned ourselves, but it sounded like something was trying to talk for the first time, like an animal. In a raspy, but still high-pitched voice, I could make out a very small portion of what it was trying to say. Gee, fuck, hot. It kept repeating this, until it started to sound more enunciated, more human. What the fuck was that? It sounded like JD. Same accent, same speech pattern, same voice. JD started to shiver. His breath was getting shallow. He shouted back in a scared voice I'd never heard come from his mouth until now. Get out. Leave us alone. Get the fuck out. Leave us alone. Get out. The last words that we heard were in the same scream we heard when we saw it initially. It started to pound on the door. Not like it was trying to force itself in, but like an impatient knock. It started to scream in the same pitch we heard it when we initially saw it. Get out! Get out! Get out! It terrified all of us. The inhuman screams, the polite pounding on the door. I started crying. I thought this was it. Neil wasn't scared, like us. He was right pissed. He stood up storming towards the door, screaming. He swung open the door, pointing his shotgun at whatever was on the other side, pulling the trigger, filling all of our ears with the sound of a shotgun blast, and the ringing to follow. Neil stood at the door, huffing. His body language was wanting to rip this thing apart. I stood up, looking past his arm, seeing nothing but a shell on the ground. I looked up past his shoulders. seeing nothing on the driveway and the road leading back to where we came. He turned around, the adrenaline fading away, and a shaky voice coming from his mouth. "We're not staying here. JD, call Katie and tell her to get ready to go back home when she comes back." The rest of the time, all of us were in the kitchen. The shotgun sat on the counter with several shells near the butt of the gun. None of us wanted to say anything. None of us wanted to look at each other. It was nothing but silence until Katie called us. Neil quickly wrote a note, leaving it on the gun as we left. All of us hopped into the car, silent. Katie noticed our behavior and constantly edged us to tell her what happened. She pouted and put on her music to cheer us up. The only thing I could hear was the blood-curdling scream, telling us to get out. Number 2. My background. My dad is full-blooded Navajo from northern Arizona, and my mom is white. I grew up in SoCal, but grew up going to the res every year and eventually moved and worked there. I'm not a skinwalker expert by any means, but I'll share what I know. The first experience I had was on one of my first solo trips without my parents, out to our ranch on the reservation. I went with my cousin and a few friends. Our ranch is pretty much in the middle of nowhere, the nearest people being at the very closest 10 miles away, so you're pretty much on your own. Our first night out there, we arrived around 2 a.m., and there was no moon, and it was pitch black, so we had a hard time finding our hogan, a traditional octagon-shaped Navajo house. We decided to just camp near a cattle corral, which we found. We set up tents and knocked out until the sun came up. When I woke up, I took a little walk around our campsite and found coyote tracks which encircled our camp and actually got pretty close to the tents and campfire, which was pretty weird and a bad sign for several reasons. The rest of the day went without incident. We woke up, cooked breakfast, explored the rim of the Grand Canyon on the reservation side, and checked out old hogans in the area. We stayed up partially late that night. We had been out exploring at night and four-wheeling off some road trails. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. We were driving up a rocky road that went up to a small canyon, so there was hills pretty high and steep on both sides of me. I was standing in the back of the truck with a spotlight. That was when I saw the first light. The best way to describe what I saw was the visual effect of when you're standing in a room and someone behind you takes a picture with a flash. There was a brief instant in which everything lit up behind me, but it was a dull orange reddish light. I turned around towards where it came from and shined the light around, but there was nothing there whatsoever. Just a bunch of rocks. We thought it was weird, but kept driving. Once on top of the hill, we stopped to look around and noticed the weird light again, but this time it was far away, at least several miles. It was the same color, but looked like a muzzle flash from a gun. I waited and waited to hear the gunshot, thinking it was people like us shooting at night. But it never came. Then we saw another flash, but this time it was several miles west, and a bit closer. Then another closer and closer, within a few minutes. We decided it was a little weird without talking about it, turned around and went to the hogan this time. We didn't really talk about the lights for some reason, and we all settled down in the hogan. There was myself, my cousin, and my 2 white friends. We talked for a while, and it was at that moment when everyone stops talking and everyone is just about to fall asleep when this happened. The door. There's only one door, a small wooden door which locks shut, shook violently as someone kicked the door as hard as they could. It was loud and strong enough to where you could hear the lock rattle and the door bounce back and rattle against the wooden frame. My friends shot up and said, "What the hell was that?" They had good reason to be alarmed. We were very far from anyone else, and they knew that. It's extremely quiet out here, pretty much deafening silence, and you can hear when vehicles are approaching. I got out of bed, grabbed a shotgun, and told my cousin to get his rifle. I walked to the door, motioned for him to come over, and said, "You get left, I'll go right." I'm not really sure why, but I wasn't scared despite the obvious weirdness of what was going on. I ripped the door open, and we both slipped out the door after one another and swept the area. Looked everywhere we could, and went to the truck and got the spotlight and swept the area. Nothing. No footprints, no animals, nothing. We decided to send a message and shot some rounds off to scare whatever it was anyway. I think we were all kind of worried, but eventually went back to the Hogan and settled back in, kind of joking about it to calm our nerves. Eventually, we all fell asleep, but I hid my nervousness, and my heart was still racing. It wasn't until everyone was quiet and asleep that I noticed a thumping. I heard it very faintly through the rock walls, and when I put my ear up to the wall, I heard it a lot better. It was a very rhythmic thumping sound, something very heavy, and timed the same every single thump. It sounded as if it was coming through the rock table that the Hogan sits on top of. I tried to rationalize it and told myself it was just the cows, and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up the next morning and we went to check the cows, which were about 10 miles away on the ranch and hadn't been anywhere near our Hogan last night. Several days later, I told my aunts about what happened. They told me that one of my Navajo grandparents who lived alone and out in the middle of nowhere had weird things happen too. The same night we had our door kicked, someone had knocked on her door in the middle of the night. When she opened the door, there was no one there. My aunts think it was a skinwalker who was messing with me and my cousins because we're mixed. I had a lot of weird stuff happen when I was working there as an EMT as well. It was around 2008, in northern Arizona on a Navajo reservation just on the border of the Hopi Reservation, which oddly enough is inside the Navajo Reservation. I was working as an EMT for the tribe and had just gotten my medical license a few weeks ago, and it was on one of my first shift where I wasn't third hand on the ambulance with 2 other EMTs. I was working night shift on a spring night. It was a little chilly, but not cold enough to need a jacket. The moon wasn't really out, so it was another dark night on the res. We were stationed outside the emergency department, working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and responding to 911 calls. We got paged out for a man-down call to the Hopi village with no other information. We usually asked assistance from the police department in securing the scene just because that's standard protocol, and a lot of times it's a nightmare call. There's a possibility of domestic violence or rowdy people, but as there's very few police present on the reservation, there were no police units available to respond with us. We were on our own. We responded code 2, lights but no sirens, and made our way to the village, which was only 10 minutes away. We arrived on scene and immediately saw the patient lying on the ground in the dirt in front of the house. It actually turned out to be a distant relative of mine somehow. I had never met or known him, but I think he was my cousin's distant uncle. He was breathing, but drunk and unconscious. He looked as though someone had either kicked him or stomped on his chest. Nothing required us to load and go, but we would transport him to the hospital to sober up and just to be safe. We checked in his house, found some drunks, might have been the people who assaulted him, and kicked them out. Now it was partially dark, and in the Hopi village, in that section, there were no streetlights. The only lights we had were the big lights on the side of our ambulance, which cast a big circle of light around the unit. There weren't any porch lights either, so it was pretty dark aside from the ambulance area. What I first noticed was quite weird. A few residents came out of their houses, which was odd because it was 2 a.m. But this village is small, so I didn't think much of it. It was pretty eerie though, because they all stayed just on the outside of the line which the light made. I could tell that they were just neighbors, but they seemed reluctant to walk into the light. At first we arrived, there were lots of dogs barking, and all of the normal noises, birds, cars, bugs, etc. We were outside by the patient, just about to get him onto the stretcher when everything changed. Out of nowhere, there was an incredibly loud howling, which pretty much sounded like a werewolf in a movie. It lasted for a good 15 seconds, long enough to make us freeze and look at each other. It sounded almost exactly like a wolf, but was odd because it sounded like a person doing a wolf call. But it was way too loud to be done by a person unless they were standing right next to us. You could actually feel the reverberate through your body. I had lived there for about a year at this point, so I wasn't super new, but knew enough to where I looked at my partner with a "is this normal?" look. Somehow he knew I was asking without verbalizing it, and shrugged while looking around nervously. I looked back around and all the people were gone in an instant. There was no one around whatsoever. You wouldn't have known that they were even there. Even the people we kicked out of the house were nowhere to be seen, and all of the normal noises were gone. All of the dogs immediately stopped barking, which usually doesn't happen. If anything, the opposite usually happens when there's a noise. Dogs go crazy. We took the sign of everyone getting out of there as a cue to get out. My partner said, "Let's get the hell out of here," and we loaded the patient and were driving out of the village, probably the fastest I've ever seen a non-crucial patient get transported. It wasn't until years later I moved away. I saw the Navajo Cops episode of The Howler, but I found it pretty interesting, considering the area that the episode was pretty far from where we were. Edit. I don't know if that was a skinwalker, or really what it was. Take it as you will. This is the story of my first encounter with an odd creature I grew to call Skinwalker. I didn't start calling them that until I came face to face with one a second time. I am now 17, but when this happened I was 9. At the time, I lived in a very small town in Michigan called Stockbridge. The town lies outside of a semi-thick forest, and I've been told by my dad much of it was cut down. My house was on the outskirts of town, near the woods. There wasn't much to do in the town. There were no fun places to go, and I had no video games or TV. So me and my friend Jake would spend all of our time outside. Both our parents were comfortable with us being outside without supervision and let us do what we wanted. The day this story takes place was August or September and was already dusk. My dad agreed that Jake and I could take his dog for a walk in the woods as long as we didn't stay out too long. We had been walking a path which led to a creek and had been planning to turn back once we reached it. It was about 15 minutes away from the edge of the woods. We were 10 minutes into the walk and Jake's dog, Midnight, had begun sniffing everything in sight. He was a well-trained dog most of the time. We could walk with him through the woods without a leash. But before the walk, we had gotten him really excited and he still hadn't calmed down completely. A small animal saw Midnight and quickly ran back the way it came. Midnight, still a bit hyper, bolted after it, ignoring Jake's cries for it to come back. Jake and I ran after Midnight as fast as we could, but we soon lost the sight of him, and had only the noise of his barks to follow. The chase lasted a few minutes until we caught up to Midnight. He had stopped to sniff at a tree. We took a few moments to catch our breaths before we turned to follow the path we had made, crushing through the underbrush. Midnight was now walking happily beside us. We hadn't gone very far when Midnight stopped, sniffing the air. Once again, he had turned and ran into the foliage. This time, he wasn't wagging his tail or barking, just running. Again, we chased him, but he wasn't going that fast and kept slowing down, like he wanted us to follow him. We stopped at a small hill that overlooked a clearing. I remember this part perfectly. Midnight started to quiet growl, and his fur started to rise. I remember being confused, but I couldn't see anything. The noise of something moving reached my ears. As I looked in the direction of the noise, a deer crawled into the clearing. This deer crawled, not limped or walked, it crawled like a child. I remember being transfixed on the deer. I saw it had no tail, and its face and body was oddly human. Its eyes were a bit too wide, and its nose was a bit too short and pointed, and its ears were too circular. At one point, it got so close, I could see that around the pupils of its eyes were white. This is not normal for a deer. None of us made a sound, not even Midnight, as it walked around the clearing. It must have seen us, but I guess it didn't give a damn, as long as we didn't disturb it. After walking around the clearing 3 times, it walked closer toward the middle. It slowly raised itself to be standing on all 4 legs. Once it did that, it stretched its front legs out for a few moments, like a cat. Once done stretching, it raised its front legs, kind of like a horse can. Unlike a horse, it raised until its back was straight and its arms fell to its side. Midnight started barking like someone was trying to kill him. He sounded angry and dangerous. This was not the first or last time I heard Midnight bark like that, and it didn't even cause me to look at him. Instead, I continued staring at the deer, who was now staring back at us. Its eyes were wider than they had been, and it froze like a deer caught in the headlight of a car. After an unknown amount of time of Midnight's barking and the deer's staring, the deer turned and started to run on 2 legs through the woods. It ran like a man, arms swinging slightly up and down, like a person can do. It was faster than anything I had ever seen, faster than any deer once it heard a gunshot. Minutes passed and we all just stood there, staring at the area where it ran. Soon, Jake turned to Midnight, who was now relaxed, and told him to walk with us. I remember leaving the clearing, but for the life of me I can't remember how we found the trail or exited the woods. Both of our parents were terribly angry with us. We had been in the woods for almost an hour, and by the time we got back, it was really dark out. We both told them what happened in the woods, but they said the deer must have been injured or something. Even at us insisting that the deer stood up, they told us it was just our imaginations, and that there was nothing to worry about. Jake and I talked about a lot after that. We also talked about my second encounter when it happened. Sadly, I moved and lost contact with Jake. This is my second encounter with a skinwalker. This happened when I was 10, and unlike my first encounter, I do not remember much of the fine details such as time, date, or exact location. I do remember that this happened sometime in winter 2011 and took place in Canada. This happened when I was 10. I didn't know that skinwalkers were a thing at this point in time, and so my idea of skinwalkers and yours may be extremely different. My dad was thinking it would be cool, suggesting that the entire family take a trip up to Canada to visit his brother, my uncle. My mom shot that shit down immediately, as it was in the middle of winter and very cold. My dad, who can talk anyone into anything, anyone but my mom, got her to agree with him. After my dad talked some more, he was able to take only one child with him. He could take the eldest child, a boy of 10, me. My mom wouldn't agree to anything else. A week went by, in which I assume my dad got everything sorted out with James, my uncle. My dad and I loaded into the car with our suitcases and started the multi-hour drive to our destination. This was my first time out of the country, and so I spent most of my time staring out the window. Before I knew it, we were stopping safely at our destination. We must have crossed through a border check at some point, but I don't remember it. Our destination turned out to be a cabin in the middle of the woods with no civilization for miles. It was fantastic. This remains the only time I visited Canada, but the woods were beautiful. I remember being awestruck by them. The trees were a different type than in Michigan. The nature was loud with animals, and there were some bird calls I couldn't place. And the snow was deep, but seemingly untouched. I met James and his family for the first time. The first 3 or 4 days were a blast, exploring my new surroundings and just having fun with others. My family isn't big on guns. Up until this point, I had never even seen one. My dad hesitantly said yes, believing his brother and his promise that he wouldn't actually let me shoot it. James got his gun, which was some kind of rifle, I believe, and we went into the woods. I followed him as we walked, wondering what the gun would sound like. We hadn't gone far before we reached a fence that had cans on top of it. James showed me all the parts of the gun, even unloading it, so I could hold it. He showed me how to shoot, and I had a good time, even though I actually wasn't shooting at the cans. An hour went by, and it started to snow. At this point, James and I were cold, so we decided to start heading back. I don't know how close we were to the cabin when I saw it. Over some brush, I saw what I thought was a deer standing on its hind legs, walking like James and I were a moment before. I went running towards it, all of my memories of the previous year's running deer flooding through my head. Running deer was what Jake and I started calling it, thinking that it was a name that fit the creature well. James saw me running and must have seen what I was running towards. It was massive, bigger than a deer by at least 1.5 feet. He quickly caught up with me and put his hand in front of me to stop me from going any closer. We just watched it for a bit. At first it had its back turned to us, and I could see it didn't have a tail. After a few moments it noticed us and turned around. Its face was unlike the deer's. Ears too round, nose too short and pointed, and its eyes too wide. Again I could see the whites of its eyes. Other than that, the face was completely different from the deer's. For one, it was a moose, not a deer. Those two animals don't look much alike. For another, it looked surprised. The deer had seen us, but no emotion at all ever crossed its face. Not even when midnight had started barking. But the moose looked shocked. It looked like it had found an unknown creature. I watched the moose with curiosity and wonder. The moose looked at us with something in its eyes. I couldn't place it at the time. Years later, I was 12. I saw the same look in another creature's eye. The creature was a starving dog, guarding its kill from me as I walked by. That look was hunger. The moose started walking toward us. It didn't get 3 steps before I heard a gunshot. Immediately after the gun was fired, the tree directly behind the moose seemingly exploded. Without a moment's hesitation, the moose turned and ran, faster than anything that size should be able to move. I didn't watch it as it ran. I had fallen over, ears ringing. I had been wearing earmuffs while James was shooting earlier, but I had taken them off while we were walking back. The ringing gave way to a splitting headache. I have never been so close to a gun when it fired. I have heard that being close to a gun when fired can leave you close to death for a while, but the ringing seemed to wear off after a few minutes. James was in front of me when he shot. Maybe that had something to do with it. Anyway, once it was evident that my hearing was back, James made me promise not to tell anyone anything that just happened. Me being 10, I told my dad. James and I saw a moose, and it was standing just like a man, just like the deer. As soon as I got back, James was standing right behind me and everything. I remember James saying something like, "This kid's got one hell of an imagination," and my dad just started laughing. I have tried talking to James about this. I tried just before writing this, in fact, but he always seems to avoid the subject. He even went as far as to hang up on me when I tried pushing for information earlier. This is my 3rd story. At the time, I was 16 and lived in Massachusetts. I've also lived in Michigan and Wisconsin and have had encounters in both. I live near Boston, but was going on a road trip with my friend and his family out to their new place in the remote parts of Massachusetts. I'll call my friend Chad. We got to their house, and I was planning to stay for about a week to help them get settled in and to see the surrounding area. At the edge of their property, they have these woods, which start off with just a few trees here and there, but after a 5-minute walk, it gets really dense. On the third day of being there, Chad's mom says she wants to give me and Chad a day off, so we could do whatever we wanted. At first, we wandered around the property and hung around the house. Then we choose to walk to the closest town. This takes 30 minutes. The town is small and there isn't much to do, but I'm happy just to be back in a place like I lived for most of my life. Small and in the middle of nowhere. We talked to an owner of an ice cream shop, which told us a bit of history about the town, nothing important or exciting. After that, we had started back to Chad's house. We got back around noon, and I suggested we go for a walk in the woods. Chad, who isn't the outdoorsy type, said no, but after a couple minutes of me nagging him, he agreed to go. Even though I go out all the time, I camp and walk the trails at night most of the time. I have gotten paranoid due to skinwalkers and other stuff, so I always have a pocket knife with me when I go out like this. So I ran inside the house to get it. We started into the woods, leaving an obvious trail. Like I said, the woods were very thick. At first, Chad spends his time grumbling things like, there's too many bugs, it's too damn warm outside to be doing things. Keep in mind, this was the last month in October. After a while, he started to enjoy being outside, and he actually says he liked it, and wanted to go further into the woods. By now, it was 4:30, and it was rapidly getting dark. But I didn't really care that much. We kept walking into the dark, to the point where I couldn't see much. We had started on our way back, but at some point we had gotten separated. I noticed this and turned on the flashlight on my phone, spinning around to see if I could see Chad. I couldn't. "Chad!" I yelled out. "Can you hear me? If you can, say something." I waited, and a few moments later, off to my right I heard a feeble stammer. "Zach." Zach is my name. It sounded like Chad, and I quickly turned to the direction of the noise and slowly walked towards it. I didn't see anything, so I moved my light horizontally to try to spot anything. I called out again, "Chad!" and got "Zach" again. It was much stronger and louder this time. I walked forward with more confidence, but stopped dead in my tracks as I heard something big move very quickly through the bush right behind me. I whipped around frantically and came face to face with Chad. At first I was stunned. I had heard him from the opposite direction. Up to this point in my life, I had only encountered a skinwalker with another person once, and we were together when it happened. So this situation was new to me. What the hell were you doing behind me? Why didn't you come from the same direction as your voice?" I practically yelled at him, overcome by anger at being tricked like that. "What are you talking about? You were the one changing directions," Chad yelled back. "What?" I said quietly. I shined my light on him. I could see he was obviously shaken. "I heard you call my name and I started to walk toward you. You sounded scared or hurt at first, but after a few minutes you started saying my name normally. Then you stopped answering my calls and I heard you from behind me, and I saw your light, so I started running at you," he explained. I was scared, finally putting the pieces together. I had never encountered a skinwalker that could impersonate a person's voice before, and I realized it was in the woods with us. There was a faint noise of movement behind me. I turned around to see a horrible sight. Not 10 feet in front of me, its head looked like a wolf's, like the kind you would see at a zoo. It was at least 6.5 feet tall. Its head, shoulders, and arms and chest were all covered in thick gray and white fur. Its legs and most of its stomach held a much thinner pelt of the same fur. Both Chad and I saw the creature, and ran faster than I thought we could. For whatever reason, the creature didn't chase us, and we made it out of the woods without incident. Chad told his family, who didn't believe him. I didn't tell mine because they haven't believed me about this stuff in the past. Chad has not gone back to the woods, and has not seen the beast again. I haven't thought about this in a good 10 years since it happened. I'll start at the beginning. My family moved to secluded Pennsylvania when I was 4. I was immediately entranced with living in the country, with several acres of woods behind us, and the house seemed so huge to me at the time. However, as a kid, I was always sensitive to spirits or energy, and there were definitely some creepy things going on in the house. So my parents noticed that I stayed with our dog Bambi a lot. He was a small sheepdog and my adventure buddy when we went walking in the woods. In case you're questioning my parents, they trusted me, as young as age 7, to walk around alone as long as I was with my dog. As he was very protective of me, my dad would give me his cell phone to carry with me just in case I needed any help. Up until I was 15, I spent a lot of time alone by choice. After school, I'd be home by 3:20. I'd eat lunch immediately and take Bambi out into the woods, and we'd explore the surrounding forests, fields, meadows, and ponds together. He was always right by my side and seemed really attuned to the spirit. If I felt something was in the house, he'd bark at it or whine, or I'd watch him follow it around. Usually, he picked up on the presence of something at the same time I would. Anyway, from the backyard to the left, there is a small strip of trees, and in the fall and winter, when the branches are bare, you can see the field next door, which is about 300 yards from my house itself. There is a big plane shed up there, and a kind of runway, where my neighbor would fly his biplanes off. What's kind of important to the story is we have no neighbors for a mile in every direction. It's pretty rare to see any kind of people on the surrounding properties unless it's my neighbor haying the fields in the summer. But one day, in early fall, I had been trumping through the woods with Bambi for several hours, and I let him run off the leash most of the time because he would run ahead about 20 feet and keep turning around to check if I was still there. If I had lost sight of him, he'd retrace his steps to find me again. That day, I got caught up in something, so Bambi ran off a little bit and I suddenly realized I was alone. Suddenly, there was a lot of crashing deeper in the woods, and I heard Bambi's alarm bark and a lot of yelping, and then some screeching. Raccoons and gophers really make fucking scary distress sounds, so I figured that's what it was. So I called Bambi, and he popped out of some brush, covered in pickers, and since I was spooked, I ran right back home with him. Right as I got back to the door, I stopped to catch my breath, and Bambi and I were just standing there when I spotted something standing on the very edge of the runway. It ran along the higher end of the field, and then there was a steep drop off the edge of the hill at the very end of it. They didn't appear to be wearing anything distinctive, but even at dusk, I could see that they were appearing completely black, or everything about them was very shadowy and dark. This part gives me shivers now. They were standing facing off the runway, and then I saw them hunch over and slowly raise their head and yell, "Bambi!" at the same high voice I would use to call him. They had the same vocal inflection as me too, but it sounded like they were trying really hard to sound like me. Next to me, Bambi tucked his tail under, lowered his head, and growled softly. They called again, but this time it sounded like they were losing their voice, as if they had been calling it for a while. My 8-year-old logic assumed that someone was trying to steal my dog, but why would they stand in the middle of the field and be so obvious about it? When I told my parents about it that night, they dismissed my story. The next day, I went to my cousin's house 2 miles up the road, and my uncle told me about an animal he saw the night before that he was trying to identify. He said it looked like an emaciated cow sprinting across the bridge over the creek, which was about 300 yards from the runway. And also since then, anyone who's been at my house has always been uneasy around the creek and the plane shed runway, whether or not they're interested at all in the paranormal. I know a lot of death happens in nature, but I've also found goats ripped up in the field. The nearest house with any amount of goats or farm animals is nearly 4 miles away, and a lot of unexplained things have happened up there. Number 2. Background. I'm a female, and this occurred 2 years ago when I was 18. This takes place in Maine. Every summer, my family and I go up to camp in Ellsworth, Maine. It's about a 3-hour drive from my house. The camp itself is an hour from the nearest town. I've been going to this camp my entire life. My family owns it, and I've never had an incident like this happen before. I was watching TV in the middle of the night. Both of my brothers and parents had gone to bed. I had heard a noise coming from the kitchen and realized the dogs needed to go outside to do their business. So I took my brother's 2 pit bulls and my tiny dog outside after turning on the porch light. I walked around the front yard and let the dogs off the leash. It's so incredibly dark in the woods in Maine that the porch light really only illuminated the porch and nothing else. So I tried to keep an eye on them. I was momentarily distracted when I saw a wild bird on the lake. When I looked back, I saw the pit bulls were both looking at something in the woods. I couldn't see what it was, but I assumed they'd seen a squirrel or a raccoon. It was then I realized I didn't see Alfie anywhere. She's an awfully small dog, and she's completely black. I called her a few times, and heard a soft whimpering right where the dogs had been looking earlier. I took a couple steps in that direction and called for her again, worried that she may have gotten her paw stuck between rocks or gotten stuck in a snake hole. Suddenly, I felt something moving behind me. I whipped around and looked down, and it was Alfie. She had been staying close to me the entire time. I just hadn't seen her. So naturally I was thinking, if Alfie's here, what the fuck is in the woods? I took another step forward, and the pit bulls began to growl. They were slowly advancing, and were now on either side of me, looking right into the blackness of the woods. I quickly picked up Alfie, and began to back up, very slowly. I'm not sure what I thought was there, but there's a lot of animals in Maine, and I figured the dogs knew better than I did, since I couldn't see anything. Right as I turned around, I heard the most absolutely bone-chilling thing I have ever heard in my life. Coming from the direction of the woods, I heard someone, or something, call Alfie's name. It sounded almost as if it was trying to mimic me, but it was just all wrong. The voice sounded really distorted and almost seemed to wail. I freaked the fuck out and ran inside with the dogs. I have no idea what was out there in the woods. My camp is essentially a log cabin overlooking a lake, and our nearest neighbor, who is also family, lives at least a half a mile in the opposite direction of where that thing was. So, I decided to join my best friend Karen for a 3-day stay at her grandmother's place on the reservation. Her grandmother lives near a place called Tuba City, Arizona, in the middle of nowhere but surrounded by secluded homes. We go to college together, and I was kind of interested to know about Navajo tradition. The first day we stayed, it was pretty chill, nothing out of the ordinary, but then her grandma, not old, around 65, said that a stray dog came out of nowhere and wouldn't leave. To me, it acted kind of strange and ugly looking. Black, shaggy coat, looked like a mix between a German Shepherd and a lab. That night, we were watching a movie in the living room. We had big windows that looked out into the front where the cars were parked, with the curtains wide open. Grandma was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and we were watching a movie. Next to the window is a medium bookshelf and where we keep our DVDs. Karen went to put back a DVD we had just watched, but she freaked out because that stray black dog was staring at us through the window, standing on top of the wood box outside. Not something normal dogs do, from my point of view or hers. Usually, my dog, which is a house dog, scratches the door to be let in. Reservation dogs aren't house dogs, and dogs inside houses are frowned upon in Navajo tradition, meant to protect the house and the owner. The other dogs seemed to stray away from it. Karen opened the door and yelled at it to get off the box. It ran off behind the shed. We went to Tuba City to get some groceries and came back to the house. The dog was nowhere to be seen. Nothing unusual. Grandma went to visit some people, so it was just Karen and I. About 5 o'clock, we heard someone trying to open the door. We both looked out, since there had been no car heard and no dogs barking. We looked out the living room window to the door, and there was a dog trying to open the door with its paws. 2 paws wrapped around the brass doorknob, standing on its hind legs. I thought that was weird, but it didn't really freak me out. Karen was, though. She opened the door and chased it off. Grandma came back later, and Karen told her she didn't like what she heard. We got ready to sleep. We slept in the spare room, since it had 2 beds. One of the window curtains opened a little. We turned off the light, but something sounded like it was on top of the roof. Pitter-patter, footsteps and scratching sounds, as well as panting. Weird, because the roof was way up there. It sounded like it jumped off onto a large plastic water barrel that they had. At first, we heard what sounded like barking, but as it grew louder, the dog seemed to be barking at something else. But all of a sudden, something was running around the house, barking, and it was no dog. No, it wasn't. The barking sounded human, a deep male voice barking, like it knew that we knew it wasn't a dog. Woof, 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 ruff, ruff, arf, arf, just exactly like that, adding the W's, R's, and A's, then panting again by the window, and we started freaking out. Karen decided to open the curtains to look out. In my opinion, that was stupid. There was a stray dog on its hind legs looking into our bedroom, but this time it stunk. And what I thought were 2 black holes in the neck. Another pair of eyes twinkled. Think of those ugly, glossy spider eyes staring at you, and the paws were deformed, looking like hands, and overgrown, somewhat thick, sharp fingernails. Again, both screaming and shutting the curtains closed. Grandma came running through the door, and seeing it, first thing she did was grab ashes from the fireplace, loaded 3 bullets into a shotgun from under her bed, blessed herself in Navajo, and went outside to shoot it, yelling in Navajo about how the thing wasn't welcomed here, and how it should get the hell out, and for it to go linger somewhere else. Them both being traditional, the next day they called a medicine man to come over and put cedar in the house. He prayed over everyone with cedar smoke and an eagle feather, blessed the place, and made us eat bitter herbs called eagle's gull or something, and gave me an old arrowhead. Apparently, I needed to carry one for protection, and a little pouch called a corn pullen. Seems to work pretty well. The medicine man said the dog was a skinwalker, which in Navajo is a long word, but I just call them Yoshis. The body of a stray dog which was killed by the skinwalker, made an illusion, so we wouldn't know that it wasn't a real dog. He also said that skinwalkers tend to harm people by using some sort of human bone, straw, to spit at someone and get human bones into them. Doctors can't detect it, but the medicine man that day pulled a piece of a human skull out of my grandma's right shoulder, pretty big, about 2 inches long and 1 centimeter thick. It was real because we watched him pull it out of her. That was intense. So, I lived in my parents' rental house near my school. It was kind of an intermediate form of living on my own. All the perks, not as many responsibilities. They wanted me to worry about school rather than bills, is how they put it. I still have a part-time job for groceries and other various stuff I want though. The night it happened, I'd come home to a crazy dog, Vinny. My big black lab was going absolutely bonkers. He was jumping up on me, which he never does, and barely let me get to the counter to set down my takeout. I figured he was out of water or excited for dinner. It was close to dinner time, and I paused to scruff him and calm him down, but he just kept bounding around like he wanted to tell me something. I filled his bowl and took my Thai food to the couch. I put on my favorite show and settle in. I had a paper to write, but was putting it off for a while. It was for my American film as a lecture class, which was important for my comparative lecture major, but I wasn't thrilled to write the paper on native son. So, it was probably going to be a late night for me, as I was inevitably going to put it off until late. Vinny came bounding in the living room and stood in front of the television. I stared at him for a moment as he panted furiously and started barking at me. I was quick to hush him because he has a big bark and we had neighbors. But he kept stalking around the living room, making various dog noises, whining and pawing at the carpet. I put my book down and went to give him more food just to shut him up. But his bowl was untouched. He never left so much as a kibble behind, and I became very apprehensive. He was acting like something was wrong, and he wasn't a drama queen, so I made sure all of the doors were locked and turned on some lights. "Go outside, Vinny," I said, sitting back on the couch. He whined at me and I had to get up to pull him by the collar to get him to the dog door to the backyard. He shot me a look and climbed through and I sighed, still a bit concerned, but not overly so. I went back to the living room and resumed my dinner. After a good 5 episodes or so, I got enough inspiration to go into the computer room and start writing my paper. There was a thump from outside as I sat down, but I ignored it. Vinny could get crazy sometimes and bounced all over the place, so I directed my attention to my homework and slowly got going. I'd been working for an hour or so when I heard another thump and something drag along the side of the house. I furrowed my brow and tried to concentrate on my paper, but something felt off. Vinny started barking and I rushed to the door to get him to come in. He was growling, hackles fully up, and I could barely get him back inside. I locked the dog door and tried to walk away, but he just sat there, staring at it, still growling. I cautiously grabbed his collar and opened the door. The yard looked normal. Kind of sickly in the outdoor lights, but otherwise just fine. Vinny jerked against me, and it took all I had to keep control of him. He started barking again, and I had had enough. We were going inside for the night. I made sure all of the doors were locked, and the garage was closed. Something was definitely off, and I decided to finally call the police on the non-emergency number. "Hi, my dog is acting really weird, and I've heard some noises outside. Is there any way you could have someone drive by my house?" I asked. "Of course," the woman said. "What's your address?" I told her my address and thanked her profusely. Vinny was still acting like a nutcase, but I didn't want him to go outside anymore. I felt better with him going crazy inside where he could protect me. Vinny is a big dog, fiercely protective, and really scary when he wants to be. I had a boyfriend try to hit me once and Vinny nearly bit his arm off. He may have been acting like a maniac, but if something happened, he'd have my back. I sat back down at the computer, and the measly 400 words I'd managed to write and listened to Vinny bark at the door. I was going to go crazy, and I had no real way to shut him up. I considered locking him in his crate, but I was too on edge. There was a knock at the door, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Vinny started barking his head off, and I grabbed his collar again so I could open the door. 2 policemen stood on my porch. "We just wanted to let you know everything looks okay from the street," the first said, looking a bit nervous as I held the bouncing, growling beast by my collar. "Did you want us to check around back for you?" "Oh my gosh, would you?" I asked, relieved. "That would be wonderful, right through here," I said, showing them to the back door. They went out and walked around the lawn for a few minutes and then came back in. "It doesn't look like you have anything amiss," the other cop said, "but we'll drive by later." "Thank you, I really appreciate it," I said, showing them out. I locked the door and let go of Vinny's collar. He ran into the other room to bark at the door again. Part of me wanted to go unlock it, but something told me not to. I finally had enough and put him in the laundry room with his bed and toys, hoping he'd just lie down and go to sleep. But he just kept barking and howling. It was muffled now, though, which made it easier to concentrate on my homework. After what seemed like hours, I clicked the double space option and exhaled proudly, just barely making the page number requirement. That deserves some ice cream, for sure. I let Vinny out and scooped myself a bowl and made my way upstairs to get ready for bed. Vinny usually comes with me and sleeps in my bed, but stood at the bottom of the stairs, whining, giving me a little bark. I called him, but he just stood there, panting. I was really unnerved, but left my door open so he could come to bed when he calmed down. I ate my ice cream and read a few chapters in my book, then snuggled in for the night. I don't think I'd even fallen asleep when Vinny just went nuts downstairs. I was out of bed in a flash. He sounded like he was dying or something. On my way downstairs, I heard a loud clatter and a high-pitched scream from Vinny. I found him growling, barking, whining and snarling in the kitchen doorway, fixated on something. I ran to his side to calm him down, and that's when I saw it. The dog door was halfway across the kitchen, lying limp on the tile, and something was trying to come through the hole. The thing was, it was somewhere between one of those gray aliens and a corpse. It had one shoulder and a long, oddly jointed arm claw on the floor, and it struggled to get its other shoulder through. Its skin was somewhere between pale blue and mold green, like dead flesh. The hand that was clawing at the kitchen floor was too long, like it had extra joints in its fingers, which were tipped with ugly little black claws instead of fingernails. Its face was stretched, its jaw hanging lower than it should, in a mewling, groaning, angry moan. It didn't seem to have eyes, just sunken, black, empty sockets. It started to wiggle its other shoulder through the door, and I didn't need to see any more. I pulled Vinny into the garage, not bothering with shoes or pants. I sped to my parents' house, running a few lights along the way. I told my parents what happened, but they didn't believe me, obviously. They did comment on how agitated Vinny was, though. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and I didn't go to school the next morning, opting to play sick and cuddle with Vinny all day. He'd calmed down, and that alone made me feel safe. When my parents went back to the rental house, they found the dog door halfway across the kitchen floor, and half of the backyard torn up. Claw marks were dug into the floor by the door, which they blamed on Vinny, but agreed that the situation was weird. I moved back into my parents' house and insisted they come with me to pack up my stuff. I wouldn't stay past dark either. It's all I can do to stay in school. I'm getting Vinny licensed as a therapy dog so he can come with me everywhere I go. I don't think anything like what happened that night will happen again, but if it does, Vinny has my back.